Chapter 1840. Following the feeling of pursuit, Luo Fan said, "Let's open a path." Then, he raised his hand and pinched the void, forming a strange handprint. Then, he pressed it to the side. In an instant, the originally extremely stable space-time dimensional fragment seemed to have turned into plasticine. It changed its shape at will, forming a side path that led to the depths of an unknown mine. At this moment, the entire mine seemed to shake. The originally deathly still space-time dimensional fragments suddenly seemed to have an additional mysterious power that began to be released continuously. These energies continued to accumulate and condense within the mine. In the blink of an eye, they had already turned into countless illusory figures that filled the path that had just been formed, blocking the path in front of Luo Fan and the other two. These phantoms were extremely strange. Some resembled animals, some resembled plants, some resembled mountains, some resembled rivers, and some even resembled seas and stars. They were densely packed in the path, appearing to be disorderly and not the least bit crowded. Instead, it was like a vast and boundless world. This power was a mysterious power that was between the space-time dimension and ordinary power. This power was mysterious and abnormal. It had the characteristics of the space-time dimension and also the characteristics of power. After appearing, it began to naturally stir the surrounding space-time dimension. Faintly, it actually had the characteristics of forming its own space-time dimension. Of course, it was only a trace. Not to mention compared to Luo Fan, even compared to the Space Maiden, it was many times weaker. Finally willing to show some traces? Luo Fan smiled faintly, and without hesitation, he walked toward the depths of the mine. During this process, the power formed. All kinds of strange, inexplicable, and abnormal shadows began to naturally scatter as if they had met their natural enemy. Naturally, a gap was revealed for them to pass through. However, it did not have any effect on stopping them at all. How is this possible? At this moment, there seemed to be such a voice coming from the depths of the mine. This voice was extremely strange. It contained incredible power, faintly causing the space-time dimension within the range of this voice to undergo subtle changes. But it sounded like a woman's voice. Moreover, it was clear and melodious. A woman. Wu Miao frowned and said, regarding the style of the master of this forbidden zone, she was not used to it. But now, she realized that it was very likely that the person who did all of this was a woman like her. This messed up her original estimation and made her feel slightly complicated. The three of them were not ordinary experts. At this moment, if one were to follow this passageway, every step one took would be equivalent to traversing an unknown number of light-years in the outside world. But here, it kept going in. There was always a path, and there was no end to it. After the incredulous voice was heard, the power surging out of the mine rapidly increased. Vaguely, they formed a huge city wall in front of them, preventing them from going any deeper. However, this city wall was the same as the other phantoms from before. It was unable to obstruct them at all. After seeing them, it naturally scattered and revealed a path. He bypassed the city wall and continued deeper into the mine. At this moment, the voice in the depths of the mine no longer came. Only the changes in the surrounding power became faster and more intense. The phantoms that appeared became more and more powerful, and more terrifying. However, no matter what the shadow was, it couldn't stop them. In fact, it didn't even cause any damage to them. Just like this, after countless waves of resistance had failed, they finally reached the end. They came to a strange space-time dimension and saw the source of this forbidden zone. This place was an extremely deep black hole. A black hole of space-time dimension. A terrifying black hole that devoured the power of all space-time dimensions and destroyed the power of all space-time dimensions. Around this black hole, endless vitality was constantly flowing into it. This vitality was not simple, ordinary vitality. It was the vitality that had undergone countless transformations and changes in space-time dimensions. Now, it already had various characteristics of space-time dimensions. The moment this vitality flowed into the black hole, an inexplicable fluctuation was produced, forming a slight change that could be sensed by others. It was also because of this change that Luo Fan was able to discover the existence of this place from so far away. It was also because of this that he was able to directly construct a path to reach this location from so far away. This is it. Wu Miao looked at this location with shock in her eyes. This kind of black hole was beyond her imagination. She had never imagined that there would actually be such an existence that specifically targeted the existence of multiple black holes in the space-time dimension. She never expected that such a terrifying black hole would appear in front of her. Moreover, it seemed that this was not the final appearance of this black hole. It seemed to be just a transition stage in the evolution process of the final appearance. Luo Fan looked at this scene and frowned. Although he could sense that the source of this change was here from the outside, it was still separated by so many space-time dimensional fragments and so many layers of obstruction. Even he could not clearly sense and understand everything there. Therefore, it was only now that he personally came here and personally sensed the black hole in front of him. Only then could he truly confirm what the source was and truly understand who the living being inside was. It's actually you? Luo Fan sighed and said, "You know me." At this moment, a woman's voice was heard from the black hole. This voice belonged to the woman who had been in disbelief earlier. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "The person I know is you from another space-time dimension." Following these words, a vague figure condensed in the black hole in front of him. This figure was so mysterious, so unbelievable. Even in the black hole, it was actually so clear. There was not a single blur. It was the figure of a woman. Moreover, this woman might be very unfamiliar to Wu Miao, but the Space Maiden's eyes flashed with hostility when she saw her. That was because she knew this woman. That was the true saint's disciple, Qing Longzi. "Why are you here?" The Space Maiden furrowed her eyebrows. She said coldly. Hearing this, Qing Longzi, who was also the woman, looked puzzled and said, "It seems that the relationship between you and the me from another space-time dimension is not a positive one, right? Back then, you gathered many true saints' disciples to attack us. You almost snatched heaven and earth away," the Space Maiden said coldly. There were some things that Luo Fan did not care about, but it was impossible for her not to care about. At this moment, Luo Fan did not speak and only smiled faintly. It was rare for the Space Maiden to stand up for him. So what if he let her stand up for him this time? "That is me from another space-time dimension. We are not the same person," Qing Longzi sighed. Qing Longzi said. Compared to her from another space-time dimension, her current expression was much calmer. Of course, if one were to consider what she had done, then perhaps her calmness was more like a disguise. The Space Maiden furrowed her eyebrows and said, "Why are you here? Under normal circumstances, this place is not a place that a true saint's disciple should come to." Qing Longzi from another space-time dimension said faintly, "Even rogue cultivators like you can come here. Why can't we true saints' disciples come here?" This aroused Luo Fan's curiosity. "You are also a true saint's disciple? Could it be that there are many space-time dimensions? Could there be so many true saints?" This was a doubt that had existed in his heart for a long time. A true sage was a supreme existence. They were omnipotent and immortal existences. Even for him now, if he encountered any power of a true saint, he would not be able to resist at all. He would be easily erased by any will of the other party and be completely destroyed. There were only a few of such existences in a perfect world. In this case, if there were countless space-time dimensions in a perfect world, and there were several true saints in each space-time dimension, then wouldn't there be countless true saints in a perfect world? This did not make sense no matter how one looked at it. However, it was even more unreasonable to say that the true saints in all space-time dimensions were the same and that they were all the same. After all, in every space-time dimension, there should be individuals from a different space-time dimension corresponding to these true saints. If they were all the same, then where did they go in the other space-time dimensions? Could they have been swallowed? Integrated? Unified? Thinking of this possibility, Luo Fan's heart felt heavy. After all, he also had countless corresponding individuals from other space-time dimensions. Although not all of them were friends with him, their way of thinking and behavior had a lot in common. It could be said that in every space-time dimension, he was equivalent to a confidant and a good friend of the true saint. If he wanted to become a true saint and wanted to completely swallow them and integrate with them, the result would obviously be too cruel. At this moment, when Luo Fan saw Qing Longzi, who was a true saint's disciple and had transcended his own space-time dimension, he finally had the chance to understand the truth. Of course not. Our various selves in different space-time dimensions all worship the same master. I only found out about this after transcending the space-time dimension, Qing Longzi said. How is this possible? The Air Maiden's expression changed instantly. Her thinking was not weaker than Luo Fan's. She quickly figured out all the things that Luo Fan was worried about. She also had the same worries and unhappiness. Doesn't this mean that if I want to become a true saint, I have to integrate with all the other selves? Or do I have to swallow all the other selves? She asked nervously. When Azure Dragon's son heard this, he smiled and said, "Of course that's impossible. The true saint realm itself is a realm of absolute self. Any two people, even if they are from a different space-time dimension, can't be exactly the same as you. Such an existence, no matter how much they swallow and integrate, it will only affect your purity. How can you use this as a prerequisite to become a true saint? If this is the case, no matter how much such an existence devours and integrates, it will only affect your purity. How can this be the prerequisite for becoming a true saint? How is it possible that there is only one true saint left?" The Air Maiden frowned and asked, "Do you know how many years it has been since the last true saint became a true saint?" Qing Longzi did not answer the Air Maiden's question. Instead, he asked another question. Hearing this, Luo Fan seemed to be deep in thought. Vaguely, he had already understood some of the things that he was worried about and the answers to some of the questions that he wanted to know. However, he still needed to hear it from Qing Longzi to confirm his conjecture. "How long ago was it?" The Air Maiden frowned and asked. "I don't know how long it was either. But I know that I have been a disciple of a true saint for billions of generations," Qing Longzi said calmly. Hearing this, the Air Maiden was stunned at first. Then, an indescribable look of shock appeared on her face. Billions of generations and billions of years in each generation. In this way, the age that any true saint had existed for was probably beyond the limit that could be described by numbers. "Can you think of it?" Qing Longzi said. "After such a long period of time, the individuals in any space-time dimension, how long do you think they can live? If they don't become true saints, how long do you think they can live? If they don't become true saints, there will always be a predestined fate. There will always be an end. After such a long period of time, the individuals in the different space-time dimensions of the true saints will definitely die over the long period of time. In the end, only the individual who has become true saints will be able to survive in the same space-time dimension. Therefore, there will naturally be countless space-time dimensions. However, true saints are the only ones. Even the 7 great true saints might not even be from the same space-time dimension. Perhaps they don't even come from the same space-time dimension." The air hostess murmured with a relaxed expression. There was also an indescribable shock. The relaxed look was that there was no need to devour or fuse with the selves from other space-time dimensions to have the chance to become true saints. However, the shocking thing was, There were so many space-time dimensions. Even if every true saint had so many selves from different space-time dimensions, there was only one true saint in the end. The difficulty of becoming a true divine was obviously beyond his imagination. No wonder true saints are so indifferent and allow their disciples to cultivate freely. They didn't even impart the key to becoming true saints to them. Perhaps it's not because they don't know, but because the consequences of imparting it to them would be extremely terrifying. Compared to the Air Maiden, who was focused on the difficulty of becoming true saints, Luo Fan's focus was on another position. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind. The reason why he had such a thought was because he had derived a fact from the words of Green Dragon's son. That was, if true saints were really the same true saints in countless spacetime dimensions, then the number of disciples that the 7 great true saints accepted in each generation would definitely far exceed the imagination of all living beings. Countless spacetime dimensions. Even if each spacetime dimension only accepted one disciple, then the number of disciples would still be innumerable. Such an innumerable number of disciples, if he really personally imparted the true method of becoming true saints to them, then the number of true saints who could become true saints would probably be beyond imagination. In this way, after hundreds of millions of generations, the number of true saints in the Earth universe would probably not be more than hundreds of millions of true saints. With so many true saints, it was obvious that it had already far exceeded the capacity of the Earth universe. One had to know that the number of true saints that a perfect world could withstand was limited. Only a big world could withstand the birth of an infinite number of true saints and cultivate in it. In other words, before the Earth universe passed through the 9th calamity and became a big world, if they imparted the true method of becoming true saints, it would be destroying the Earth universe. How could a true saint do such a thing? As for imparting the method in a certain spacetime dimension and not in other spacetime dimensions, that was even more impossible. To a true saint, any spacetime dimension was equivalent. The disciples that existed in it were all their true disciples. How could they be biased towards some disciples and give up on some disciples? Even if Luo Fan used his current way of thinking to think, it was impossible for him to do such a thing. Moreover, the way of thinking of a true saint might be fundamentally different from his. It would be much higher, so it was naturally even more impossible for him to do such a thing. Reality is indeed countless times more complicated than imagination. After a while, Luo Fan could only sigh. There are some things that are much easier to not know than to know about. Qing Longzi's eyes revealed a distant and profound look, and his tone carried an indescribable sense of vicissitudes. The Space Maiden and Wu Miao vaguely knew that there was an extremely deep meaning hidden in her words, but in the end, they were unable to understand it like Luo Fan, and could only frown. At this moment, Luo Fan spoke. There's no point in thinking about these things now. Let's talk about what you're doing here first. What do you mean by that? I'm here to seek transcendence and breakthrough. What does that have to do with you? Why do you have to interfere? Qing Longzi frowned and said. There was a hint of a punitive expedition in her expression. From her point of view, she clearly had the right to punitive expedition. Chapter 1841. Fellow Taoist, you seek transcendence. We seek transcendence as well. Fellow Taoist, you are now standing in our way of transcendence. How could we not come? Luo Fan simply smiled. These words caused Qing Longzi's expression to freeze. Then, he smiled bitterly. She had been in the forbidden zone of this space-time dimension for so long that she had forgotten what the relationship between normal cultivators was like. For cultivators, nothing mattered. As long as the other party was interested, as long as the other party felt that it might be beneficial to them, then any cultivator would do it. What does this have to do with you? It's so naive that it's childish. At that moment, she could only say helplessly, Then, I wonder if you got what you wanted? Not yet, but I think it's almost time. Luo Fan just smiled. Hearing this, the Azure Dragon's son turned to look at his surroundings. He sighed again and said, "This item is the foundation of my path. It's what I'll rely on to step into the higher dimensions of spacetime. It's also the foundation for me to fight against a true supreme being. But I definitely can't give it to you. It shouldn't be too difficult to enter the higher spacetime dimensions, right?" At this moment, Meow frowned and said, "As long as that door is opened, won't we be able to enter the higher spacetime dimension?" Hearing this, an indescribable expression appeared on the Azure Dragon's face. He turned to look at Meow. Countless rays of light flashed through his eyes, as if he was conducting an extremely deep analysis. Being stared at like this, Meow could not help but frown deeply, feeling rather uncomfortable. After a long while, Azure Dragon said, "So that's how it is. I didn't expect one of you to be a life form that descended from a higher spacetime dimension. No wonder you're so confident that you can find the higher spacetime dimensions." "What do you mean?" Meow faintly felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what it was. "Do you really think so? That door has never been pushed open since ancient times?" Azure Dragon's son changed the topic and asked, "Did someone push it open?" Meow exclaimed. This was completely different from what she had expected. In her imagination, it was like this. That door was so abstract and so powerful. Opening it required an extremely deep understanding of the spacetime dimension. Although there were many powerful creatures in the spacetime dimension, none of them should be able to open the door and step into the higher spacetime dimension. Of course, the spacetime dimension had existed for countless times, longer than he had imagined. In such a long period of time, there was even a true sage from a different dimension that came here. "Do you think it's possible that no living being has ever pushed open this door?" Azure Dragon's son asked indifferently. Meow's expression froze. This angle was something she had never thought of before. If he thought about it from this angle, his previous conjecture that no one could push open the door and enter would be proven true. He was still too arrogant and childish. There were so many experts, so many cultivators, and so many living creatures. How was it possible that none of them had been able to push open the gate and step into it? "So, what's the result?" Meow asked with an ugly expression. "Behind that door is an existence even more vast than you can imagine. It was a strange place where countless space-time dimensions were mixed together. The higher dimensions of space-time were hidden within. It was in between the countless space-time dimensions and was no different from the other space-time dimensions. So many years had passed since ancient times. Countless people had pushed open the door and stepped into it, but not a single one of them had sent back any news. Not a single one of them had stepped into the same space-time dimension. There were even some who died because of the changes in the space-time dimension the moment they stepped through the door. Their souls were scattered. Azure Dragon's son did not keep them in suspense and directly revealed the answer. This answer caused Meow's expression to become sluggish. Even the expressions of Luo Fan and Air Maiden changed slightly at this moment. If that was really the case behind the door, they would still have to go through this final obstacle to find the existence of the higher spacetime dimension. If that was the case, the process that they had previously thought of would be completely futile. However, an inexplicable sense of relief quickly appeared on Luofan's face. Compared to other living beings, they had Meow here. They also had the light ball that corresponded to the coordinates of a certain mountain in the higher spacetime dimension that they had obtained from the mountain bandit. With these advantages, his chances of finding the higher spacetime dimension were many times higher than other living beings. If he still did not have confidence in this, then he would have lived for so long in vain. However, this kind of understanding also made him even more determined to make a trip to the other restricted areas. After all, he had obtained this advantage by going through 2 forbidden areas here. He could also learn some things that he did not know before. He might be able to obtain more from the other forbidden areas. The more he knew, the more benefits he would gain when he stepped into the higher space-time dimension in the future. Seeing the changes in their expressions, Azure Dragon's sun sank into deep thought. After a long while, she sighed, lifted her feet, and slowly walked out of the black hole. Not long after, she walked in front of Luofan. The structure of her body was completely different from the body of flesh and blood that Luofan knew. It was a structure formed by the combination of the space-time dimension and power. This kind of structure was vastly different from the life forms in this dimension. It was also quite different from the life forms in the higher space-time dimensions, which was Wamiao. However, it also contained all sorts of extremely fine and profound principles. Even Wamiao felt as if he had comprehended something after reading it, and he faintly comprehended many things that he had never thought of before. I can't beat you right now, so I'll leave this restricted area to you. No matter what fellow Taoist wishes to do, feel free to do it. I only have one request, and that is that when you step into the higher dimensions, you must bring me along. The Azure Dragon's sun sighed. Other than Luofan's strength and Wamiao's existence, there was an even more important reason that prompted her to make this decision. Perhaps she had already made up her mind a long time ago. She wanted to use this forbidden zone to step into the higher space-time dimensions and transcend. The possibility was extremely small, so small that she shouldn't put her hopes on it. The reason why he had waited until now to make the change was because it was probably because she couldn't see any other hope apart from this. Luofan stood there quietly and smiled faintly. If there's no limit to the number of people, it's naturally not a problem. Although this wasn't a complete agreement, the Azure Dragon's son was already rather satisfied. She also didn't expect Luofan to treat her completely fairly. Putting herself in Luofan's shoes, she clearly knew that if she were in Luofan's position, she would definitely make the same decision. She wouldn't have an attitude of directly agreeing to it. Using the boundless vitality that is naturally emitted from the space-time dimensions as its power, condensing it into this kind of power that can change the space-time dimensions and condense space-time dimensional fragments. It's indeed a fantastic idea. Luofan looked at the black hole and couldn't help but sigh in admiration. The Azure Dragon's son smiled and said, "This is a method that I comprehended from the treasure that Master gave me. In terms of its roots, it's still Master's method, but it's not my method." When he heard this, Luofan was slightly stunned, and a hint of awe flashed across his eyes. If it came from a true saint, then he would have to pay more attention to this forbidden area. The importance he placed on this black hole had to be raised by at least one level. After all, once anything was related to a true saint, it would become extraordinary. It could even turn something rotten into something magical. Under such circumstances, even Luofan wouldn't dare to ignore it. It seems that he absolutely wouldn't dare to ignore it. I didn't expect it to actually come from a true saint. It seems that I didn't pay enough attention to this previously. Luofan didn't lie to cover up his previous lack of seriousness as he said this. This kind of frank performance, however, it made everyone present reveal a trace of an inexplicable expression. However, Luofan didn't care about this. At this moment, his heart moved, and he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already stepped into the black hole. The moment he stepped into it, endless waves, endless changes, and endless principles and mysteries naturally emerged. He sensed them and absorbed them to his heart's content. In a trance, he felt that he had complete control over the entire mining area. He had complete control over all the space-time dimensional fragments in the mining area. He had complete control over the power of all the space-time dimensional fragments that existed in the mining area. Thus, he could easily guide all the power and circulation of all the power within it. It was also at this moment that he sensed how this black hole resonated with his body and how it changed his body and the space-time dimension where he was. After sensing it for a while, Luofan sighed. His body shook, and the space-time dimension that was completely unique to him instantly erupted from his body. It swept across the surroundings and formed a strange defensive vacuum where he was, repelling the effects of the surrounding black hole on him. This black hole seemed to be absolutely pitch black, but in reality, there were many times more things inside than he had imagined. The entire black hole was actually formed by the condensation of countless space-time dimensions. These space-time dimensional fragments were densely packed together and intertwined with each other in a very subtle way. In the end, they transformed into all kinds of mysterious and indescribable structures, turning into the black hole in front of them. It produced an indescribable attractive force and caused indescribable changes to the body. If that's all, it can't be the means of a true sage, right? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's eyes flashed with doubt. If he hadn't said that this was a means that he had comprehended from the magic treasure given by a true sage, he would naturally have stopped at this step. He wouldn't have continued to delve deeper and search for the various mysteries on a deeper level. However, since it was said that it was a means that he had comprehended from the magic treasure given by a true sage, he had to spend more effort to comprehend it. This was not snobbishness, nor was it a random extension of the true meaning of a true sage. It was because of the meaning that a true sage represented. A true sage was not a celebrity expert or something like that. This kind of existence itself already represented an indescribably profound concept, and it itself represented a kind of supreme charm. Anything that was related to such an existence in itself already represented an unfathomable level. Under such circumstances, unless Luo Fan had already become a true sage and reached that level, he would be able to see everything he wanted to see with just a glance. Only when everything was a secret could he treat things that extended from such an existence lightly. Of course, this was what Luo Fan thought. However, it was not what he was thinking about now. At this moment, he only activated all the sensing abilities that he had. He sensed everything around him in detail and understood everything around him. He searched for the incomparably profound principles and mysteries that might exist around him. It was obviously not an easy task to search for these things. After a few days, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. He had found an inexplicable fluctuation that was hidden extremely deeply. This fluctuation was hidden in the deepest part of the black hole. It was hidden in one of the countless space-time dimensional fragments. It was extremely ordinary. It was extremely ordinary. It merged with so many space-time dimensional fragments that it could not be detected or found. This is the fluctuation? Luo Fan sensed this fluctuation, and there was an inexplicable doubt in his heart. Even in his senses, this fluctuation was so ordinary, so ordinary. If it appeared in other places, he might have already ignored this fluctuation. However, don't forget that the location where this fluctuation appeared was in this black hole. In this place, even the space-time dimension had been changed. Even Luo Fan's body had faintly been subtly affected. How could an ordinary fluctuation exist here safely? Could it spread in all directions in an extremely obscure manner? With a slight thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. In the blink of an eye, his palm penetrated the obstruction of the space-time dimensional fragments, penetrated an unknown distance, and resisted the influence of an unknown number of layers of terrifying power in this black hole. Finally, it arrived at the space-time dimension. With a grab, it had already caught the fluctuation. For an existence at Luo Fan's current level, as long as it did not exceed the limits of his understanding, whether it was tangible or intangible, he could treat it as if it was tangible. Even if it was formless, he could still treat it as if it was a material object. He could treat an intangible existence that could change as a power as if it was tangible. Just like the space-time dimension, which could originally only be regarded as a certain change pattern between the space-time dimension and the space-time dimension. To him, this kind of intangible fluctuation could obviously also be regarded as a tangible thing. Therefore, if he wanted to catch it, there would naturally be no problem at all. However, although he had caught it, the feeling after catching it was completely different from what he had imagined, because this fluctuation was so heavy. In his senses, this fluctuation seemed to be as heavy as billions of space-time overlapping. Grabbing this fluctuation, he felt as if he was pulling an unknown number of worlds at the same time. He actually used up more than half of his strength to pull it in front of him. It should be known that with Luo Fan's current strength, even if he did not use any other means, he only needed to slightly vibrate his muscles to destroy a world. Now that he wanted to pull this originally intangible fluctuation, if his strength was slightly weaker, he actually had to use up more than half of his strength. One could imagine the terrifying weight of this fluctuation, and it was also self-evident that this fluctuation was mysterious. Just this weight alone is enough to tell that this fluctuation must be related to a true divine. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. For him now, the only thing that could make him feel heavy was something that he could not understand. Otherwise, as long as it was something that he understood, no matter how heavy it was, even if it was the unimaginable weight of billions of worlds overlapping, he could use all kinds of special methods to reduce its weight and make it light, so that he could easily pick it up. In other words, for the ripples to be so heavy at this very moment, it definitely contained a mystery that he could not comprehend. Only then would it make sense. And for him, who had already passed the second great calamity, the most likely source of this existence was related to a true divine. With a thought, Luo Fan brought this wisp of fluctuation out of the black hole. When he stepped into the black hole, he seemed to be extremely relaxed. Almost in a flash, he had already arrived at the depths of the black hole. But when he left, it was as if he had suddenly turned into a snail. Every step he took seemed to exhaust his strength and his intelligence. Just like this, he spent a long time before he finally charged out of the black hole with great difficulty and arrived in front of Wu Miao and the others. What kind of fluctuation is this? At this moment, everyone noticed the wisp of fluctuation in Luo Fan's hand. Even the space-time dimension could be observed as if it was an actual object, so this kind of fluctuation was naturally not a problem. Azure Dragon's son was also in a state of shock. You don't know this wisp of fluctuation? Luo Fan looked at Qinglongzi and said thoughtfully. Of course I didn't sense it. Qinglongzi smiled bitterly. At this moment she felt rather defeated. She even vaguely knew why she, who was in a different space-time dimension, would have an unpleasant conflict with Luo Fan. The current her feelings towards Luo Fan were extremely complicated. If it was not for her rationality, she might also be extremely unhappy with Luo Fan and want to cause trouble for him. Chapter 1842. Luo Fan naturally did not care about what Qinglongzi thought. At this time, he only carefully sensed the wave in his hand. After losing this wisp of energy, the surface of the black hole didn't seem to have changed at all. It was still absorbing the vitality from every fragment of the space-time dimension in the mine, and it was still undergoing the mysterious transformation. However, if one looked closely, they would discover that the stability that it originally had was gradually disappearing. This black hole was constantly transforming towards the direction of collapse with the passing of time. It seemed that all the changes caused by external factors had started to be displayed on it at this time. It was no longer completely eliminated and suppressed like before. This change might not be noticed by ordinary people. However, which one of the people here was ordinary? Even Qinglongzi was already a disciple of a true saint who had transcended the space-time dimension. She had even changed the nature of her existence. How could she not notice such a change? Needless to say, Air Maiden and Wu Miao were more sensitive to the space-time dimension than Qinglongzi. With just a glance, they could comprehend all the subtle changes and would not be concealed. So, the key is this wave. Wu Miao murmured. There was a look of realization and shock on her face. This wisp of seemingly invisible material was extremely minute. If she was not careful, she might have overlooked it. But it was precisely this wisp of fluctuation that had created such a shocking forbidden zone. What kind of wave was this? Could it be that this was the means of a true saint? Could it be that it was related to a true saint? At this time, Wu Miao had an unprecedented understanding of what kind of existence a true saint was. In the past, she knew that a true saint was omnipotent and that a true saint could do many things that she could not imagine. However, after all, it was extremely far away from her. For example, she might have a concept of splitting open the sky and earth and knew that it was extremely difficult. However, in her impression, there was only the word extremely difficult. As for how difficult it was and what kind of level one had to reach to achieve this, she had no idea. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for her to be so shocked by the means of a true divine. However, it was obviously different now. She had witnessed such a direct comparison with her own eyes. She had witnessed with her own eyes the results that such a minute wave could achieve. She finally had an intuitive understanding of the true divine's methods, and was truly shocked. After the shock, the way she looked at Luo Fan changed slightly. Since a true divine was so powerful, if it was so unbelievable, then wouldn't Luo Fan, who had already stepped on the path to becoming a true sage, be even more powerful and terrifying than he had imagined? Wu Miao's mind was filled with all sorts of complicated thoughts. This caused her expression to fluctuate incessantly. Over here. Only the air hostess felt the purest at this moment. At this moment, she was only paying attention to the wisp of fluctuation in Luo Fan's hand, and there were no other distracting thoughts in her mind. For her, it was natural for a true divine to be powerful. Luo Fan's strength. It was only natural. He didn't even need to think about it in this way. The scene fell into silence. Not even the sound of breathing could be heard. That wisp of fluctuation was deep and unfathomable. It was so profound that even Luo Fan couldn't find any clues at the moment. Just as he was searching, a terrifying tremor suddenly came from behind him. The endless space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings let out a crackling sound at this moment. In this sound, it was as if the end of the world had arrived. It was as if everything was going to be destroyed, including everyone here. Such a change awakened Luo Fan and the others. This restricted area is going to collapse. In an instant, they all had a clear judgment. This collapse was brought about by the collapse of the black hole. The reason why the black hole would collapse was because there was no wisp of fluctuation to suppress everything. As a result, the various changes caused by the space-time dimensional fragments in the outside world would be related to the black hole, gradually causing the black hole to change bit by bit. As these changes accumulated bit by bit, it naturally caused the black hole to become unstable. In the end, it completely collapsed at a certain moment. In an instant, everyone present understood everything. In an instant, Wu Miao and the Space Maiden frowned. As the owner of this restricted area, Qing Longzi's expression relaxed at this moment. There was a look of relief in her eyes. As a disciple of a true saint, especially a true saint who had transcended the space-time dimension, Qing Longzi's understanding of cultivation and space-time dimension had reached an extremely profound level. She naturally knew what kind of things truly belonged to her. She also truly understood what kind of arrangements would allow her to achieve the success she wanted. Because she knew this kind of thing, she clearly knew that if this restricted area really relied on the wisp of fluctuation from a true saint to exist for a long time, then this restricted area would be meaningless to her. She definitely wouldn't be able to transcend through this restricted area that she wanted. If this wasn't even hers, then everything that developed from this foundation naturally wouldn't belong to her. But how could he achieve transcendence by relying on something that didn't belong to him? It was because she realized this that she felt relieved at this moment. That was because she was relieved about her previous choice. Previously, the reason why she chose to give this restricted area to Luo Fan was because she felt that there was a greater hope if she followed Luo Fan. However, it was also because Luo Fan was too powerful and she didn't have the confidence to guard this restricted area under his shadow. Therefore, she was obviously somewhat resentful about giving this restricted area to Luo Fan. And this resentment had obviously completely disappeared at this moment. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Looks like we should have one more restricted area killer." His heart stirred slightly. He swung the wisp of fluctuation in his hand, and all the space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings were instantly suppressed. Then, he swung the wisp of fluctuation again. With a strange transfer of the space-time dimensional fragments, the few of them were thrown out of the restricted area. They appeared outside the restricted area and looked at the towering mine in the distance. And beside them, the 8 followers of Wamiao also appeared naturally. It was as if they had been standing here all along. "You can actually use this wisp of fluctuation?" Qinglongzi stared at Luo Fan in shock and said, "How strong was a true divine stage existence?" Only she, who was a disciple of a true divine, could truly understand how profound it was. Because she was clear when she saw that wisp of fluctuation. She had already determined that this wisp of fluctuation would definitely not be of help to Luo Fan. It would only be a burden to him. He would at least need to be a burden for a long period of time before he could be able to understand the mystery of this wisp of fluctuation. Only then would he be able to understand the hidden principles within. But Luo Fan's method had completely subverted her views. He had only gotten hold of this fluctuation for a short period of time, and he could actually control it as if it was his own limbs. He could easily change the space-time dimension by using the power of this fluctuation. It's just a simple matter to use it. It's just like how ordinary people don't need to know the principles of guns to be able to use them. They don't need to know the principles of flames to be able to use them to roast meat. But you have to understand. I'm still too far away. Luo Fan only smiled. As he spoke, he did something that made everyone present dumbfounded. He threw this wisp of fluctuation into the mining area and allowed it to sink into the depths of the forbidden zone. As it started to tremble slightly, it stirred the space-time dimension fragments within the forbidden zone even more intensely. This caused the forbidden zone to collapse even faster. Can you retrieve it?" Qinglongzi asked expectantly. Luo Fan naturally shook his head and said, "Of course not." "Then, why did you throw it away?" Qinglongzi's face turned pale with fright. At this moment, Wamiao's eyes were also filled with disbelief. Clearly, he could not understand what Luo Fan was thinking. However, at this moment, a look of understanding appeared in the empty maiden's eyes and a faint smile appeared on her face. She seemed to have understood Luo Fan's meaning. "Because this is just my burden." Luo Fan only smiled and said this. However, he did not go into depth to explain the meaning of this sentence. These words instantly caused Wamiao and Qinglongzi's expressions to become dull. They had no way of understanding what Luo Fan was thinking at all. Burden? This wisp of fluctuation might be extremely heavy. Perhaps its suppressive power would affect people greatly. However, compared to the principles and mysteries contained within it, what was this? Who would abandon this fluctuation because of such a burden? Wasn't this giving up eating for fear of choking? "If you don't want it, I want it," Qinglongzi shouted. His eyes flashed and he raised his hand to grab at the space-time dimension fragments that were becoming extremely chaotic in the forbidden zone. In the blink of an eye, a power that was somewhere between space-time dimensions and power burst forth from his body. It quickly weaved in the void space, turning into an extremely complicated, mysterious, and unfathomable palm. It reached into the fragment of the pair of empty space fragments and grabbed onto the wave of energy. "I caught it!" Qinglongzi's eyes were filled with joy. However, in the next instant, her expression changed drastically. The power in her body surged frantically, and the space-time dimension that formed her body began to change rapidly. Boundless vitality erupted continuously, turning into all sorts of terrifying power. She frantically poured it into the invisible palm and tried her best to maintain it. Unfortunately, the result disappointed her. This also shocked Miao and the empty maiden. That was because it was as if the palm didn't exist at all. Even the speed of its descent didn't slow down at all. It continued to descend, stirring up the space-time dimensional fragments around it, completely releasing the deathly stillness within and causing destruction. During this process, Qing Longzi's extended palm kept grabbing at the fluctuation. From the way he was using his strength, it was clear that he was using all his strength to grab it, this situation. It was clear that all of Qing Longzi's actions, methods, and power were unable to affect that fluctuation at all. In fact, they could not even cause the slightest change in the fluctuation. This scene, coupled with the way Luo Fan had grabbed the fluctuation and swung it around effortlessly, was enough to shock anyone. How could it be so heavy? Qing Longzi's veins popped up on her face, and she seemed to have lost her original beauty as she shouted. However, it was a pity that those fluctuations wasn't an obedient puppy. Her shout was unable to affect the ripples in the slightest. That fluctuation continued to descend into the depths of the void and was gradually drowned in the chaos of the countless space-time dimension fragments. In the end, it was impossible to find. Qing Longzi's power had its limit. After a long time, it was finally completely cut off and could no longer extend further. In the blink of an eye, it was as if an extended spring had suddenly been released, and an earth-shattering rebound force was unleashed. This caused a shocking commotion. It turned around and returned. It caused the space-time dimension around Luo Fan and the rest to be thrown into a mess. Fortunately, Luo Fan was here to suppress it. Otherwise, this kind of rebound, they would probably end up in an extremely pathetic state. At this moment, Qing Longzi's face was ashen, and there was an indescribable emptiness in her eyes. Everything that happened just now was too much of a blow to her. It was so huge that she didn't dare to believe everything that had happened just now. Relax. This kind of thing is inevitable when you follow him. Miao comforted her at this moment. These words obviously didn't have any effect of comforting her. Instead, it made Qing Longzi's expression turn even uglier. She was the disciple of a true saint. She had cultivated for billions of years and had never encountered such a thing before. All this while, it was others who felt this kind of shock from her, okay? After a long time, Qing Longzi finally couldn't suppress the doubts in her heart and asked Luo Fan, "Why did you throw that fluctuation?" Her expression was extremely serious, and her determination to find the answer was extremely firm. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Didn't I already say that it would only be a burden?" At this moment, the few of them were already in front of another restricted area. This restricted area was a stone forest. At the very least, it looked like a stone forest. As far as the eye could see, it was densely packed with stone pillars of all shapes and sizes. Some were tall and some were short, and their colors were all strange. It was extremely strange, and it seemed to contain some kind of special law and principle. Burden? Don't tell me that the principles and mysteries within can't suppress those messy burdens. Qing Longzi continued to ask relentlessly. At this moment, she directly stood in front of Luo Fan and raised her head to stare into Luo Fan's eyes. She didn't even blink, and her pupils seemed to be frozen as she stared deeply into his eyes. This kind of attitude made the Air Maiden a little unhappy. She said indifferently, "This is our cultivation secret. There's no need to tell you." Cultivation secret? Qing Longzi's body trembled, and he suddenly woke up. To any cultivator, the secret of cultivation was the most important secret. Any secret could be inquired about, but once the secret of cultivation was inquired about, it was very likely that it would end in a fight to the death. "That's right, it's the secret of cultivation," the Air Maiden said calmly. When he heard this, Luo Fan also shut his mouth. Originally, to him, it was not a big deal to tell the other party that the burden referred to the principles and profoundness of the true saint. However, since the Air Maiden had already said this, he naturally would not overturn her conclusion. After all, compared to the Air Maiden, what was Qinglongzi? "Let's go. I think the owner of this restricted area should be waiting for us," Luo Fan said with a smile. As he spoke, wisps of indescribable fluctuations appeared in the stone forest. Amidst these fluctuations, the entire stone forest blurred slightly and gradually disappeared, leaving only a boundless desert where the stone forest had originally been. A piece of space-time dimensional fragments had spread out to form a barren land. This change finally attracted the attention of the Air Maiden and the others, and they turned their gazes to where the stone forest had originally been. "How could it disappear just like that?" Miao frowned and said. The disappearance that she was referring to was, of course, not the disappearance that had disappeared in front of her. Instead, it was the kind of disappearance that had disappeared from all her senses, from all her understanding, the kind of disappearance that had disappeared. That's right, at this very moment, that forbidden zone, that stone forest, had indeed completely disappeared from Miao's senses, as if this stone forest had never existed, and this forbidden zone had never existed. Unable to figure it out, Miao grabbed a follower beside her and asked, "What's going on? Is this the strangeness of the restricted area?" The follower that was captured was a powerful life form of the space-time dimension. Naturally, he was clear about the many restricted areas in the space-time dimension. When he heard this, he hurriedly said, "Master is wise. There has never been such a change in this restricted area. At least, there has never been such a rumor. This is the first time this has happened in my memory." These words made Miao frown. The first time it had appeared? Could it be that the restricted area had always been hiding itself and was only revealing its strangeness now? Is there a need to ask? "He's hiding from us." Qinglongzi looked at where the stone forest had originally been, but there was an indescribable expression in his eyes. This expression was a little sympathetic, but it was also a little funny. Chapter 1843. The Lord of the restricted area was definitely the kind of absolute power that could overlook the entire space-time dimension. He was a powerful existence that all the experts and living beings in this space-time dimension could not look directly at. It went without saying that the arrogance of such an existence was very strong. Normally, even in the face of death, he would never give in. However, it was precisely this kind of Lord of the restricted area that used a method to hide the entire restricted area when Luo Fan and the others arrived. This kind of cowardly behavior was really beyond Miao's imagination. It was also because it was beyond imagination that Miao could not think of this fact for a moment. "Other than hiding from us, I can't think of any other possibility." Qinglongzi sighed. As someone who was also in a restricted area, Qinglongzi understood the Lord of the restricted area very well. It must be known that Luo Fan had gone to 2 restricted areas previously and both of them were completely destroyed. Moreover, each restricted area only took a short period of time to completely disappear. It went without saying how exciting this kind of change was to the Lord of the restricted area. It was obviously not strange that the Lord of the restricted area had some misgivings in his heart and hid the restricted area. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that her mining area did not have any concealment methods, she might have already hidden the restricted area before Luo Fan stepped into it. At this time, Luo Fan only shook his head at this time and sighed. He pointed at where the stone forest originally was. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable power surged out from his hand and poured into it. In an instant, the space-time dimension fragments produced all kinds of mysterious changes and began to undergo some kind of extremely complicated and extremely subtle reorganization. As this change continued, a stone forest faintly appeared. At this moment, Wamiao's expression changed. She also began to feel the existence of the stone forest more and more directly. There's actually such a powerful concealment method. This restricted area is not simple. This was her judgment. In her senses, she could see that the restricted area was continuously appearing at this time. However, she had no way of knowing the fundamental principle of its concealment. It was as if the restricted area was there to begin with and was only gradually lifting the barrier that was covering her senses. As for other things besides this, as for the principles behind the forbidden zone, he couldn't figure it out no matter how hard he tried. However, no matter how shocked Wamiao was, Luo Fan did not stop moving. As the power that rushed out of his hand changed more and more violently, the stone forest finally reappeared not long after, as if it had never disappeared. It still covered the area in front of them. "Why must you force me?" At that moment, a voice rang out from within the stone forest. It was impossible to tell if this voice was male or female, old or young. It was so grand and shocking. It was as if the entire space-time dimension was emitting a sound that came from all directions and was transmitted into everyone's ears. Luo Fan's expression didn't change as he said, "I just want to see your origin." Such impolite words were a great offense to any cultivator. However, not a single person's expression changed because of this. In the cultivation world, the strong preyed on the weak. The strong could naturally decide everything. They could know everything. Although wanting to know the origin of the weak was a great offense to the weak, to the strong it was their right. The person who spoke just now was obviously the lord of the restricted area. The way he spoke was not through his body but through the vibrations of the entire stone forest, using the vibrations of the entire restricted area to form words. As a result, his words had such a special quality. At that moment, the vibrations of the entire stone forest were a bit chaotic. It seemed like the lord of the restricted area was saying something. However, due to the trembling of his mind, he couldn't control the stone forest perfectly and make it speak. After a long while, only then did the vibrating sounds within the stone forest become smooth again. Only then did the sounds they formed once again converge into a single voice. "Why must you do this? The origin of us cultivators is an absolute body. If you want to see my origin, you will fight me to the death," the voice said. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "It seems that your origin is hiding a great secret." These words caused the voice to become chaotic again. However, this time, after the voice was smoothed out, it didn't say anything else. Instead, the stone forest suddenly began to expand rapidly and crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had become tens of thousands of times bigger than before. In an instant, Luo Fan and the others were completely wrapped in the stone forest. At that moment, all of them felt an indescribable power appear out of nowhere and affect their bodies. This power didn't have any offensive power, but it had a teleportation effect. After it affected them, it wanted to randomly teleport them in different directions and scatter them. This was one of the power of the stone forest. In an instant, this thought flashed through everyone's mind and they understood the source of the teleportation power. The 8 cultivators who were Wamiao's followers showed expressions of terror and an indescribable sense of despair appeared in their hearts. They were able to exist freely in the restricted area because of the protection of Luo Fan and the others. If they were randomly teleported away, it would be equivalent to breaking away from the protection of Luo Fan and the others. At that time, what awaited them would be facing the power of the restricted area without any cover or defense. To them, it would be death and their souls would be destroyed. It would be the deepest despair. No! Their faces were filled with terror, and they even spat out similar words and phrases one after another. At that moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. With a thought, an indescribable power was released from his body and enveloped everyone present in the blink of an eye. With a slight tremble, the power of the teleportation was isolated, allowing everyone present to escape the power of the teleportation. Puff! There was a soft sound. Many of the surrounding stone forest suddenly collapsed. In the blink of an eye, a large empty space had been cleared out. It made it seem as if this area didn't belong to the stone forest or the restricted area. In the face of such a change, the stone forest changed again. Wisps of mysterious power began to quickly condense and weave around the bodies of Luo Fan and the others. They constantly combined and formed the shadow of a stone pillar. They began to radiate around Luo Fan's body like a millstone. The power that isolated the power of the stone forest came crashing over. At that moment, an earth-shattering sound was emitted from the point of contact between the two. The entire space-time dimension was filled with this sound in an instant. At that moment, countless beings cast their gazes toward this location from all directions. It's starting again. This is the third restricted area, right? All sorts of thoughts appeared in their minds. Among them was the Lord of the restricted area. Compared to the other beings, the lords of the restricted area were more concerned about this place and more afraid of the changes here. This was because they knew that the changes here were very likely what they would have to face next. If they still couldn't get rid of Luo Fan here, then what awaited them would most likely be the outcome of the previous two restricted areas. That kind of ending where the restricted areas would be destroyed and they would be suppressed or killed. Just who is this person? He's actually so hostile to us restricted areas. This thought flashed in the mind of one of the lords of the restricted area. A fierce emotion emerged from the bottom of his heart. If it wasn't for the fact that this place was a restricted area, it was an absolutely independent place where other beings couldn't interfere. Perhaps he had already interfered at this time and directed his power here to help this restricted area attack Luo Fan and the others. However, although they couldn't interfere, they were still paying close attention to this place. They did everything they could to analyze the methods and power of Luo Fan and the others. Regarding all of this, Luo Fan was naturally well aware of this. However, he couldn't be bothered to care. Although this space-time dimension was mysterious, but to him there was nothing that could threaten him. Even if it was such a strange space-time dimension change. To him, it was just interesting. It wasn't enough to really affect him. Facing the crushing power of the stone forest, he raised his hand and pointed at the air. In the blink of an eye, the boundless power gathered and turned into a palm. With a slight tremble, it moved in a mysterious trajectory and instantly inserted itself into the cracks of the boundless power. It easily destroyed the power and emptied the surroundings, causing the stone forest to become extremely calm. Then, with a thought from Luo Fan, the power of the palm suddenly turned into a path that traversed towards the depths of the stone forest. Through the various changes in the stone forest, he had already discovered the source of the changes. Perhaps that place wasn't the true source of the restricted area, but it was definitely related to it. In other words, the Lord of the restricted area might not be there, but there were definitely enough traces left there. Under these circumstances, if he wanted to find the Lord of the restricted area, going there was clearly the best choice. This path was like a supreme existence that would not move for eternity. As it stretched out, it suppressed some of the movements and changes in the stone forest. No matter how hard they tried, they were unable to move like before. The various powers that were constantly gathering seemed to have their source blocked, unable to move at all. "Let's go," Luo Fan said to the air hostess and the others. As he spoke, he stepped onto the path and slowly followed it into the depths of the restricted area. This stone forest looked like a stone forest, but in truth it contained countless dimensions of space and time and countless universes. If an ordinary cultivator wanted to cross this forbidden zone by walking normally, it would be impossible even if they spent billions of trillion years. The power of the restricted area itself was enough to make it impossible for them to leave even if they died of old age. However, this was clearly not a problem for Luo Fan. Under the path formed by this power, the countless dimensions of space and time in the restricted area were like the cornerstones of this path. Countless universes were like the cornerstones of this path. They could only support this path. However, they couldn't produce much effect. The Lord of the restricted area naturally had to put in a lot of effort to stop Luo Fan and the others. For a time, countless dimensions of space and time swarmed over. Countless stone pillars started to change wildly, producing all sorts of indescribable power. They did their best to bypass the suppression of the path and gather on it, wanting to stop Luo Fan and the others. However, it was a pity that all of this, for this path, it was useless. It was fine if the power didn't get close to the path. It could still exist and produce all sorts of effects that would shock any cultivator. However, once they got close to a certain range of the path, they would be instantly suppressed and turned into the cornerstones of the path. They would become a part of the power that supported the path, unable to produce the effects that the Lord wanted. With all these changes, the path no longer looked like a path. Instead, it looked like a tunnel, a deep tunnel that led to an unknown place. The surroundings of the tunnel were filled with endless power. It was filled with endless power, covering everything. Miao and the others couldn't see anything behind the power. It was as if the entire world, the entire space-time dimension, and all the universes that they knew had turned into this power. However, this change also resulted in a result, and that was the destination of the path. At this moment, the place in front of him had become even more conspicuous. Vaguely, there seemed to be a deep vortex at the end of the tunnel. This made Miao and the others understand. Although this path was extremely long, if it was really measured by distance, it was probably trillions of light years away. However, for Luo Fan and the others, it only took them half a day to completely cross it. When they came to the end of the path, they finally saw the source that Luo Fan wanted to reach. It was a vortex that was faintly discernible, seemingly illusory, yet real. This vortex was formed by the condensation of a mysterious power. Even the fragments of the space-time dimension no longer existed in this vortex. Or rather, they had been completely twisted apart and turned into something more fundamental. Behind the vortex there was an indescribable aura. This aura was extremely obscure and subtle. Under normal circumstances, even Miao and the others would find it difficult to detect the existence of this aura when there were countless space-time dimension fragments and countless mysterious powers in the surroundings. However, at this moment, the surroundings were completely covered by that terrifying power. In a situation where there was only this path apart from that power, this aura was very obvious, and everyone present could clearly sense its existence. What a strange aura! Miao frowned. At this moment, the Air Maiden and Azure Dragon's expressions became solemn, and an indescribable doubt appeared between their brows. This aura doesn't fit in at all with the space-time dimension. No, it doesn't fit in with this perfect world. The Air Maiden's eyes flashed as she said this. This sentence instantly caused Miao's and Azure Dragon's expressions to change drastically. How is this possible? They exclaimed almost at the same time. Of course, this did not refer to the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up, nor did it refer to the perfect world of a certain space-time dimension. Instead, it referred to the perfect world of the entire Earth universe. What did being incompatible with the entire Earth universe mean? It meant that the aura came from another perfect world. It meant that it came from another perfect world that was equivalent to the Earth universe. However, this was obviously impossible in the minds of Miao and Azure Dragon. It must be known that the distance between the two perfect worlds was not as tightly connected as the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up, which was practically attached to the Earth universe. The distance between the two perfect worlds was an incomprehensible chaotic state. Although the chaotic state could be used as a unit to measure the distance, this unit was only meaningful to true saints. To all existences below the true saint level, the chaotic state, even if it was space-time with countless zeros behind the decimal point, was still an unimaginable distance that could not be crossed. Under such circumstances, when a living being from another perfect world appeared in a perfect world, any living being would only think of a true saint. Meow and Azure Dragon were no exception. At this moment their expressions became extremely ugly, and there was a vague sense of panic hidden in them. Could it be that a true saint from another world wants to invade our world? Azure Dragon said with an extremely solemn expression. If that's the case, then it's bad. I think we should leave this place as soon as possible. Being caught in the middle of a war between two worlds, small ants like us will die if we're not careful, and our souls will scatter, Meow said at this moment. The aura of another perfect world. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes were burning, and there was an inexplicable sense of excitement in them. However, he was not as panicked as Meow and Azure Dragon. Meow and Azure Dragon did not understand the transmigration between two perfect worlds. In their hearts they felt that it was extremely unfathomable, and they could not think about it rationally. However, he was different. Chapter 1844. How could it be another perfect world? Qing Longzi muttered with shock and an indescribable sense of vigilance. As a disciple of a true divine, she could be considered to have finished her apprenticeship. She still had a different perspective from other cultivators. She saw the entire perfect world as her home and the other perfect worlds as her enemies. Under such a perspective, suddenly seeing a cultivator from another perfect world was like suddenly seeing a person from another country. The first thing that came to her mind was, of course, whether the other party was a spy, whether he was here to inquire about information, and whether he was here to prepare to harm this perfect world. Luo Fan did not say anything at this moment. He raised his hand and pointed at the whirlpool in front of him. In an instant, a strange power suddenly rushed into the whirlpool and began to stir with the whirlpool. It gradually merged with the whirlpool and went one step further, developing in the direction of controlling the whirlpool. At this moment, a terrifying sound came from the whirlpool. All kinds of indescribable movements came from it. Strands of power belonging to the space-time dimension began to appear from the depths of the whirlpool and continuously attacked the power that Luo Fan had sent into it. The effect of this attack created an earth-shattering movement, causing the whirlpool to show signs of collapsing. However, this was only a sign. Whether it was Luo Fan or the existence behind him, they both wanted to preserve the whirlpool. The changes that could cause the whirlpool to collapse were suppressed by them. Thus, although the whirlpool seemed to be on the verge of collapsing, it finally stabilized and continued to slowly spin in front of them. Suddenly, Luo Fan's eyes flashed. He raised his hand and another wave of power rushed out and poured into the center of the whirlpool. A blood-curdling scream suddenly came from the whirlpool. Even the movements of the whirlpool at this moment could not be suppressed. It was as if the scream was not a sound at all. Instead, it was a kind of terrifying spirit wave that was directly transmitted into the soul. At this moment, Luo Fan merely smiled in the face of such a situation. He had poured his power into the vortex and was prepared to control the vortex's power. With a slight tremble, the extremely stiff resistance completely collapsed. In an instant, the whirlpool was completely under his control. After the whirlpool came under his control, he swept his eyes around and clearly knew the origin of the whirlpool. He understood where this whirlpool led to and what was behind it. It was a spacetime. In other words, it was a world of its own. This part of the world was extremely strange. At first glance, it seemed to be no different from an ordinary world, but if one were to carefully sense it, one would realize that everything in this world was completely different from any world that Luo Fan had ever known. Regardless of whether it was the space-time dimension, the rules and laws, or even space-time itself, they all had their own characteristic. They were all related to the Earth universe, the primordial world, and the Tianyuan world. The Jiuli Great World and other perfect worlds or great worlds were fundamentally different. This was the aura of another perfect world. In other words, this world was a part of another perfect world. This isn't our world. At this moment, Green Dragon's son exclaimed. He had also sensed the situation of this space-time through Luo Fan's control of the whirlpool and had formed his own judgment of this world. At this moment, this part of the world seemed to have started to undergo various subtle changes due to the influence of the whirlpool. According to the rules and laws, time, space, and the Great Tao, even the space-time dimension seemed to have suffered some kind of indescribable corrosion. It started to gradually transform into the state that Luo Fan was most familiar with. This was clearly the world. This space-time was losing its state as another perfect world. At this moment, a figure appeared from the depths of the world. This was a figure with 3 arms. This was a figure with an octopus-like head. Its body looked ugly no matter how one looked at it. However, the aura that emanated from its body was extremely powerful. It was even only slightly weaker than Luo Fan's. Compared to the Sky Maiden, Wamiao, and even Green Dragon's son, it was much stronger. At this moment, this creature sensed the various changes in the world, and an indescribable hatred appeared in its eyes. It shouted, "All of you deserve to die." As it shouted, a boundless and terrifying power quickly gathered in the world and turned into an extremely thin strand of airflow that was the size of a strand of hair. It quickly rushed towards the whirlpool. In other words, it was charging straight towards Luo Fan and Qinglongzi, who were currently peering at this world and this heaven and earth. That strand of airflow surpassed time, space, space-time dimensions, and everything else. As it rushed out, it had already crashed into the whirlpool. Then, it passed through the whirlpool and reached Luo Fan and Green Dragon's son. Bang! Green Dragon's son's body couldn't withstand the impact of this strand of airflow at all. It instantly collapsed and turned into countless fragments that spread out in all directions like an explosion. After this change, Azure Dragon's son let out a muffled groan. Following that, specks of space-time dimensions continued to condense, and Azure Dragon's pale figure appeared above where he was originally. The aura on his body was more than 10 times weaker than before. It was obvious that even though the impact from before did not take her life, she had paid a great price and suffered great injuries. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ended up like this. In contrast, Luo Fan, who was also hit by that wisp of airflow, or rather, was the focus of that wisp of airflow, did not react at all. It was as if this strand of airflow was really just an ordinary airflow. It stood there quietly and didn't even shake, let alone explode. What a powerful impact! However, Luo Fan sighed and raised his hand to grab at the air on the surface of his body. A strand of airflow rushed out of his body. It fell into his hand. This strand of airflow contained a kind of true divine level power. Although it was very little, to an existence below true divine level, it was already considered an irresistible power. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan had already gone through the second great trial of heaven and earth and used the endless power to temper and improve his body during the process, he might not have been able to withstand the impact of this strand of airflow. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and rubbed it gently. With a slight tremble, the strand of airflow had already dissipated into nothingness. In the end, at a certain moment, this strand of airflow scattered in all directions as if it had never appeared. However, at this moment, many of the space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings unknowingly collapsed. It even caused the boundless power surrounding this path to produce wave-like undulations that spread in all directions, forming an earth-shattering commotion. At this moment, the existence in the world had already arrived before the vortex. Its 3 palms joined forces and directly pierced into the vortex. Its power was terrifying. Its ingenuity had reached an indescribable level. It directly poured into the vortex, causing the vortex to undergo a shocking change. The three palms seemed to have grown tens of thousands of times stronger. They directly rushed out of the vortex, condensed all the power of the vortex, and grabbed at Luo Fan and the others. At this moment, the power that Luo Fan had integrated into the vortex was instantly repelled. Even though he had originally completely controlled the vortex, he was completely unable to come into contact with it at this moment. However, after a final observation, Luo Fan saw that the originally extremely perfect world had completely collapsed. At this moment, it had completely collapsed. The originally stable Great Tao and stable nomological law layer. Even the normal spacetime had now completely shattered and turned into an indescribable existence that seemed to be in a state of chaos. It continuously flowed into the creature's body, continuously increasing the creature's own power and improving its essence. Sacrificing that world? As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's figure flashed and he arrived above the vortex, in front of the three palms. Then, he raised his hand and beckoned. The endless power around him was already under his control. As he moved, it condensed, transformed, and turned into three palms, brazenly blasting at the three palms that had rushed out of the vortex. Crack! An earth-shattering sound came from the collision. Vaguely, the entire space-time dimension produced a strong vibration at this moment. Vaguely, it was unknown how many space-time dimensional fragments suddenly collapsed. This kind of movement was even more shocking and terrifying than the previous two forbidden zones that had been destroyed. Moreover, it was unknown how many creatures could not maintain the stability of their bodies due to the intense vibration. Similarly, they completely collapsed in this terrifying turbulence and died a violent death, as expected of a forbidden zone assassin. Somewhere, a voice filled with fear and shock rang out. Although the source of this voice could not be found, all creatures instantly agreed with what this voice said. Even those who disagreed couldn't voice their objections after seeing the terrifying power that had appeared above the stone forest's forbidden zone and the terrifying undulations that constantly affected the entire space-time dimension and made the entire space-time dimension as fragile as tofu. In an instant, all the creatures in the space-time dimension began to move. However, they did not come to the stone forest forbidden zone to stop the changes in the forbidden zone. Instead, they headed to various places in the space-time dimension and began to work hard to help the many creatures that had been greatly injured by the terrifying turbulence. Although the cultivators in the space-time dimension were not models of love and love. But this did not mean that there was no friendship between them. In fact, in any world, in any level of space-time dimension, as long as there were intelligent creatures, all kinds of gratitude and hatred between intelligent creatures would inevitably exist. However, this was not enough to attract the attention of Luo Fan and the Lord of the Forbidden Zone. At this moment, they only had each other in their eyes. The Lord of the Forbidden Zone from another perfect world had already gone completely crazy. At this moment, he did not care about anything else, even if it was something that he could bear. He was going to unleash his strongest attack and continuously attack Luo Fan. Boundless power, boundless might. There were all kinds of attacks that Luo Fan had never seen before, and it took him some time to understand them. They were constantly being displayed on his body. The three palms were constantly changing all kinds of seals on the road, constantly displaying all kinds of mysterious changes. The impact that erupted from them was so great that just the aura and fluctuations alone had already torn the road to shreds and completely collapsed the power of the forbidden zone that surrounded the road. All kinds of attacks were constantly pouncing on Luo Fan. He wanted to tear Luo Fan into pieces and completely annihilate his life source. That kind of soaring hatred had simply materialized and formed a real world. In the face of such a powerful offensive, Luo Fan did not fight back. No matter what kind of attack the other party threw at him, he was able to neutralize it in a moment of concentration. Traces of comprehension could be vaguely seen in his eyes, as if he had comprehended some inconceivable profundity during this process. Although the entire road had completely collapsed due to their battle, it was still filled with energy. However, Luo Fan still used his own power to protect the road under their feet, which had a radius of several hundred feet. This gave him, as well as Space Maiden, Wu Miao, Qing Longzi, and the others enough space to support themselves, so that they wouldn't end up without a place to stand. As for safety, that went without saying. They could even protect their footholds. Luo Fan naturally wouldn't let those attacks miss him and attack them. This battle lasted for dozens of days. During this process, the entire space-time dimension seemed to be in the midst of doomsday. All kinds of terrifying tremors that could cause the space-time dimension to collapse and cause the death of all living beings in it were shrouded in every single moment. If it weren't for the fact that the powerful creatures in the space-time dimension had made preparations in advance and helped the living creatures in various places to survive this great calamity, there might have been no more weak creatures in the space-time dimension after a few dozen days. Is there an end to this? Someone finally couldn't take it anymore and suddenly roared. This voice directly spread throughout the space-time dimension, allowing all the living beings in the space-time dimension to hear this voice in an instant. Even Luo Fan and the others in the Stone Forest's forbidden area. All of them had heard this sound as well. In an instant the tremors stopped slightly. The entire space-time dimension was at this moment. It finally obtained a peace that they hadn't felt for dozens of days. This change, which should have made all living beings feel relaxed, didn't make any living beings feel relaxed at this moment. There was only a sense of oppression that came before a storm. Immediately after, there was a loud rumble. Somewhere in the space-time dimension, the body of the living being that had roared just now suddenly exploded, turning into a huge mushroom cloud that soared into the sky. This caused the space-time dimension to once again experience indescribable tremors. In fact, this time, it was even more intense and terrifying than before. The impact would be even worse. For a time, apart from this tremor, there was no other movement in the space-time dimension. No other living beings dared to speak again. All of them silently carried on with what they were doing. Why bother? At this moment, in the Stone Forest's forbidden area, Luo Fan sighed. The one who had wiped out the person who had spoken just now was naturally not him, but the Lord of the Forbidden Area, the living being from another perfect world. As for how it had used this attack, it didn't rely on any direct method to bypass him and launch an attack. Instead, it relied on the source of the voice and used that person's roar as a guide to transmit the attack through that voice. That was why it was so straightforward and easy to destroy that living being and completely erase all traces of its existence. This attack was extremely strange. It was similar to a curse, but it was even more mysterious than a curse. This was also the first time that living being had used this attack. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan didn't notice it earlier and missed this attack, causing that living being to suffer an unexpected disaster. However, this was only just now. Now that he had seen this attack, if this attack wanted to be effective again, regardless of whether it was against him or others, Luo Fan had enough power to destroy it and intercept it. "You destroyed my world," the Lord of the Forbidden Area said. This was the first time he had spoken in the past few dozen days. As he spoke, his figure gradually appeared behind the vortex. However, this time, he was no longer in the world behind the vortex. Instead, he was behind the vortex in the space-time dimension that Luo Fan was in. The aura of the world that Luo Fan had seen before faintly spread from his body that had already become extremely huge. Luo Fan could tell with a single glance that this was a sign that he had completely devoured that world. "I destroyed your world? You seem to have destroyed that world yourself, right?" "All I did was take a look," Luo Fan said calmly. As he spoke, he casually clenched his hand and crushed the formless, terrifying attack that the other party had sent out, causing the surrounding space-time dimension to ripple slightly. As the living being spoke, he didn't stop his attack. At this moment, an indescribable hatred appeared in the living being's eyes. He said, "It was your gaze that destroyed my world." As he roared, a strange flame suddenly ignited on his body. Chapter 1845. This kind of flame was burning so fiercely that even an existence like Luo Fan could feel an indescribable heat invading his body from the surroundings. It must be known that Luo Fan was a powerful existence that had survived the Second Great Tribulation. To make him feel scorching hot and unbearable was something that could only be found in the Great Calamity. However, in this place, the flames ignited on the body of this creature from another perfect world could actually do this. It was able to make him feel as if his body was about to be ignited. The power and terror of this flame was self-evident. At this moment, Luo Fan finally felt that this was the first time he had encountered this creature. Die! The creature roared, and the flames around its body surged wildly. They quickly gathered in midair, and finally turned into a ball. It appeared in the shape of a ball and crashed towards Luo Fan. During this process, all the surrounding space-time dimensions, all the power, and even the existence of everything after they were destroyed could not have any effect on the ball of light formed by this flame. This allowed the flame to penetrate everything and brazenly arrive in front of Luo Fan, instantly wrapping him in it. An indescribable heat crazily poured into Luo Fan's body, quickly impacting the composition of his body. Even the endless power inside his body was triggered at this moment, producing all kinds of abnormal changes. It faintly impacted everything around him, causing the surrounding space and time to appear out of thin air. However, in the blink of an eye, they completely disappeared under the burning of the flames. This kind of flame was increasing crazily at this moment, as if there was no limit and no boundary. As the power of the flame increased, the light emitted by the flame became more and more intense, more and more dazzling. Finally, at a certain moment, the flame finally broke through its limit. Instead, it formed a huge black hole that did not emit any light. No heat was emitted. This was none other than the existence in the middle of the transmission of light and heat had been completely burned by this flame and could no longer exist. Even the existence in the middle of the transmission of light and heat could no longer exist. This position had naturally turned into a black hole. What a powerful flame! It's definitely not a flame that this space-time, this world should have. Luo Fan thought to himself. With this thought in mind, his mind began to move. He began to use all of his thoughts and effort to ponder, to find the truth behind the various flames around him. During this process, the flames were constantly destroying his body. His body gradually melted during this process. His body gradually lost its form. The boundless might in his body and the worldview that had already fused with his body also suffered an indescribably huge impact during this process, and it faintly showed signs of wavering. Such a terrifying injury. Even during the Great Tribulation, it didn't appear on him at the beginning. At this moment, the creature that was emitting these flames, an indescribable malevolence appeared on the face of the existence that came from another perfect world. A look of delight could be seen in his eyes. However, he was not an ordinary person after all. After all, he was an existence whose cultivation had reached an extremely high level. At this moment, he did not hysterically shout things like, "Die, die, die," like other people would. Instead, he also used his thoughts in a frenzy, frantically searching for all the changes that Luo Fan had revealed. Through these changes, he searched for the various roots and essences behind these changes, so as to further harm Luo Fan and further achieve his goal of revenge. After all, Luo Fan's current situation looked extremely tragic. It was hard to deal with, but that was only on the surface. Fundamentally speaking, Luo Fan had yet to suffer any truly irreparable injuries. But how could this satisfy the lord of the restricted zone? *T. At this moment, Qing Longzi finally reacted. He cried out in shock and was about to attack the fireball. But at this moment, the air hostess raised her hand and pulled him back. There's no need to attack. He can deal with it. When Qing Longzi looked at her with a shocked and uncertain gaze, the air hostess stated her reason. These words caused Qing Longzi to be suddenly stunned. She turned her head to look at Wu Miao, who was beside her, and found that although Wu Miao looked worried, it was only a little and not to the extent that she was so worried that she would overestimate herself and want to attack. Are you really that confident in him? She felt that it was a little unbelievable. It was a good thing to have confidence, and it could even be said that it was natural. However, to have such confidence to the extent that they even allowed the other party to be attacked and did not care about the other party's incomparably wretched state, it was clearly a little too much. You haven't seen the tribulation he encountered before. Wu Miao sighed at this moment and said, Tribulation. Qing Longzi seemed to be deep in thought, and his heart was filled with a desire to investigate. What kind of inconceivable tribulation must he have experienced for them to have such strong confidence in him? Could it be that that tribulation was dozens of times stronger than the flames that would completely destroy her if she came into contact with it? Under these various probing emotions, she stopped herself from attacking. Although her eyes were still filled with bewilderment, she still stood beside the air hostess and Wu Miao, quietly watching the changes that would inevitably shock her. The black hole formed by the flames hung in the boundless chaos for several days. Just when the worry in Wu Miao's eyes had increased to a certain limit, and she almost couldn't help but attack, a change finally began to appear on the black hole. That black hole gradually began to squirm, and faint traces of flames began to leak out from it. They continuously attacked the surrounding space-time dimensional fragments and the surrounding power fragments, causing the space-time dimensional fragments and power fragments to start a new combination, gradually forming a completely different space-time dimensional fragment. They formed various kinds of power, combining into unknown space-time and heaven and earth. Although these space-time and heaven and earth couldn't exist stably under the flames. Very quickly, they disappeared under the burning of the flames and were erased. But compared to the original absolute darkness, it was already enough to shock the air hostess and the others. Following these changes, the distance between the flames and them seemed to have been pulled further apart. Originally, it was only a few dozen feet away from them, but now it felt like it was hundreds of millions of light years away. If it weren't for the fact that none of them were ordinary cultivators, perhaps they wouldn't have been able to see the existence of this ball of flames at this moment. The amount of the flames leaking out rapidly increased. Not long after, the black hole completely collapsed and was completely replaced by the flames. Then, within the flames, a vague figure began to gradually condense from a ball of paste, taking shape once again. After dozens of breaths, that figure truly stabilized. His face had also been completely revealed, becoming incomparably clear. It was Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan opened his hand, and on his palm, there was a ball of flames that was brighter and more dazzling than the surroundings. It was constantly growing. Not only was the light of the surrounding flames weakening, but the heat was also decreasing. Combined with the fact that the heat was also decreasing, it felt as though the ball of flame in his palm was devouring the endless flames around it. Another figure with an octopus head gradually emerged from the flames. This figure was completely condensed from the flames. It was extremely clear and obvious in the huge ball of flames. At this moment, his body was extremely distorted, as if he was resisting some kind of extremely terrifying suction force, struggling to escape from something. And looking at the direction he was escaping from, it was impressively the ball of flames in Luo Fan's hand. Obviously, the ball of flames in Luo Fan's hand was really swallowing the endless flames around it. Although this creature wanted to escape from the swallowing of the ball of flames, It was a pity that over the past few days, through his own comprehension, Luo Fan had already grasped the true essence of this ball of flames. Now, he had already relied on his own worldview to restructure this ball of flames. Now, he had already relied on his own worldview to restructure this ball of flames and his ability to control it. He had long surpassed its original owner, which was to say, this was the creature itself. Under such circumstances, no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't escape from the swallowing of this ball of flames. He could only watch helplessly as his body continued to be sucked into the flames and gradually disappeared without a trace. In the end, in just a short 2 hours, the huge ball of flames had completely disappeared. Luo Fan's figure reappeared in front of everyone without any obstruction. However, the ball of flames in his hand had already turned into an existence that resembled a black hole. Only the wisps of aura that belonged to that creature still existed within it. This appearance was simply a microcosm of the state that Luo Fan was in when he was swallowed by the ball of flames previously. It was just that the roles had been reversed now. With the appearance of Luo Fan, the absolute chaos in the surroundings began to gradually calm down. The fragments of the space-time dimension gradually condensed again, and the incredible power also gradually dissipated. As for the turbulence that constantly echoed throughout the space-time dimension, it completely disappeared at this moment. In the end, it didn't take long before the stone forest's forbidden zone gradually stabilized. However, the horror of the forbidden zone had completely disappeared and was replaced by an ordinary stone forest formed by space-time dimensional fragments. It's finally over. For a time, countless creatures throughout the space-time dimension heaved a long sigh of relief. All of them had the same thought in their minds. After experiencing the destruction of several forbidden zones, they had never looked forward to the disappearance of a forbidden zone as much as they did this time. When all these changes calmed down, all sorts of complicated emotions were born from all over the place. Some were sadness, some were joy, some were anger, and some were hatred. All sorts of emotions were born because of the many creatures that died in the turbulence just now. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an inexplicable expression on his face. There was only an indescribable expression on his face as he said, "Which world are you from?" His voice pierced through the flames. It entered the ears of the creature in the flames. At this moment, the air hostess and the others had already surrounded him. He looked at the ball of flame in Luo Fan's hand with an extremely curious gaze. Of course, Luo Fan didn't get an answer to his question. At this moment Qing Longzi asked, "What kind of flame is this? How can it have such a terrifying power?" Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Don't you find this kind of flame very familiar?" Qing Longzi frowned. This answer was obviously not what she wanted. However, it was obvious that she was the one asking for advice. How could he transfer money? Naturally, she could only listen to him. At this moment, she could only use her brain to think carefully about this kind of flame. When had she seen something like this before? After all, she was a disciple of a true saint and had seen a lot of things. After thinking for a while, she suddenly revealed a look of disbelief and said, "This is karmic fire. How is this possible? How can the power of the karmic fire be strengthened to such an extent?" Her words caused both the Air Maiden and Wu Miao to reveal looks of surprise. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, the karmic fire was an absolutely terrifying flame. In the eyes of ordinary cultivators, the karmic fire was an absolutely terrifying flame. It could even be said that it was an unsolvable flame. However, this was only in the eyes of ordinary living beings or ordinary cultivators. In fact, it didn't even need to be a false saint or a false saint. As long as a cultivator reached the sage-to-be level, they could already ignore this kind of karmic fire. In other words, even if they fell into the karmic fire and let it burn for billions of years, it wouldn't cause any harm to them. Even a sage-to-be could do this, let alone them who were at least at the Supreme Emperor level at this moment. However, the power of the flame just now was so terrifying that it had even hurt Luo Fan. It even made Qing Longzi feel that if she was not careful and touched it even a little, her body and spirit might be destroyed. Such a flame. The power of the karmic fire was obviously worlds apart from what they knew. How could they believe that this was the karmic fire? Luo Fan heard this. He just smiled and said, "Of course it's the karmic fire. However, it has an essential difference from the karmic fire in your understanding. This is a kind of karmic fire from another perfect world. It has been tempered by the chaos and is stained with a bit of the characteristics of the chaos. The karmic fire can withstand the tempering of the chaos." Qing Longzi frowned. The karmic fire was such a fragile existence that it couldn't even withstand the crushing of her power. No matter how much karmic fire there was, as long as she suppressed it with a bit of her power, it would be completely destroyed and disappear. She believed that such a karmic fire could withstand the tempering of the chaos and still exist after going through the chaos. However, she didn't believe it at all. If it's simply throwing the karmic fire into the chaos, it naturally won't remain. However, if an expert uses himself as a sacrifice and sacrifices himself to the chaos, then the appearance of this karmic fire is natural. Luo Fan just smiled faintly. Sacrifices to the chaos? Qing Longzi's eyes were filled with astonishment. Even though she was a disciple of a true saint, she had only heard of such a method and didn't understand it. Now, she could actually see the results of such a sacrifice. "I didn't expect you to know so much." At this moment, a voice came from the ball of flame on Luo Fan's palm. Along with this voice, the ball of flame, or rather, the black hole, faintly emitted wisps of flames. In the void, they gradually condensed into a figure with an octopus head and 3 arms. At this moment, this figure had a look of shock and uncertainty on its face. It seemed to have some kind of conjecture, as if it didn't dare to believe its own conjecture. "You must come from a great world, right?" Luo Fan looked at this person and said faintly, "You really aren't a native of this world." The octopus creature finally said in shock, "Native." This word made Qing Longzi and the others frown. The word native was usually used when a creature with a higher level of civilization looked at a creature with a lower level of civilization. Now that this person said that he was a native of this perfect world, it was clear that he thought that his level of civilization was several levels higher than that of this perfect world. This, to the people who had always thought highly of themselves, was simply a huge blow. It was enough to make them feel indescribable anger in their hearts. This kind of attitude of being superior to the perfect world is indeed the expression of a creature in the great world. Luo Fan said at this time. The creature looked at Luo Fan and said, "Since you are not a native of this perfect world, why are you going against me? Have you not heard of the name of my great God refining world? So you are from the great God refining world. However, it's a pity that I am ignorant and do not know what great God refining world is." Luo Fan smiled faintly. "Humph. My great God refining world has 3,000 true saints. They are incomparably powerful and are the rulers of this piece of chaos. In any great world, there will definitely be legends of the great God refining world. You actually haven't heard of it. It seems that you are either a native from another perfect world, or you snuck in from outside this area." The person from the great God refining world looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable expression. His eyes seemed to be mixed with contempt and bewilderment. From this look, it was obvious that he couldn't tell what kind of situation Luo Fan was in. Chapter 1846. If there's a stowaway, then there should be a normal entry. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. "I didn't expect that I would still be a frog at the bottom of a well, even though I used to think that I was experienced and knowledgeable." The reason why he said that was very simple. What did it mean to enter the country normally? It meant that there were connections between the various worlds, and there were even all kinds of convenient or troublesome transportation. This was the same as what Luo Fan had thought in the past. There were many perfect worlds, and many great worlds were independent of each other. Only true saints could communicate with each other. However, there was a world of difference. When the octopus head figure heard this, he frowned and said, "You actually don't know? It seems that you are indeed just a native of another perfect world." After saying that, his body shrunk back into the ball of flames, as if he couldn't even be bothered to talk to Luo Fan. Just like a civilized person who couldn't be bothered to talk nonsense with some natives, for this expert who came from the great divine refinement world, he had no interest in talking to a native like Luo Fan. Seeing this, Luo Fan only said indifferently, "Although the 3,000 true saints' great divine refinement world is unimaginably strong. However, I remember that no great world can interfere with a perfect world with a true saint. Now that you have stepped into this perfect world, I believe that you did not use any proper method." As he said that, he shook his hand and a powerful force poured into the fireball in his hand. In an instant, the power of the fireball exploded. Endless terrifying flames frantically strangled and killed, forcing the figure in the flames to rush out of the ball and appear in mid-air. This kind of coercion was an extremely simple matter for Luo Fan, but for that creature it was a shocking change. Because the concealment method he used at this time was a method from the great divine refinement world. It was just like how he had used the sacrificial method to obtain the hellfire that had experienced the state of chaos. This method of his, it also had mysteries that surpassed the level of the perfect world. And this kind of method in his mind, no matter how strong Luo Fan was, he might be able to destroy him, but he would never be able to force him to do something he didn't want to do. It was because of this consideration that he was able to hide in the fireball so calmly. However, he did not expect Luo Fan's power to carry a temperament that seemed to only exist in the vast world. This kind of aura had an unimaginable effect. It actually caused him to have nowhere to run, causing him to want to abandon his life and stubbornly stay within the flaming sphere. He was unable to do so, so all he could do was reveal himself. Apart from the abnormality of this method, what shocked him even more was the content of Luo Fan's words. "How do you know this? Could it be that you've been to some big world?" he said in disbelief. At this time, Wen Miao and the others couldn't help but look at Luo Fan with a strange expression. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Can't you deduce this conclusion just because you haven't been there? We are cultivators, and not ordinary fools, vulgar beings." Hearing this, the octopus-headed creature couldn't help but reveal a bewildered expression. One had to know that although these words did not sound good, it seemed to be somewhat possible. He carefully considered the words he had said before. After secretly weighing it, he realized that he could really deduce these conclusions from these words, and this kind of deduction really didn't seem to be too difficult. Under all kinds of complicated thoughts, the gaze he looked at Luo Fan with became even more hesitant. He wasn't someone who believed what others said. He naturally had his own thoughts and his own understanding. Although it seemed to make sense from a logical point of view, who knew if the other party was just lying to him? For a moment, he didn't believe it either. As a creature of the God-refining great world, you have violated the rules of many great worlds. Thinking about it, if someone were to find out, your fate is unpredictable. Luo Fan said indifferently. True saints were omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient existences. Normally speaking, as long as there was an existence at the level of a true saint in any world, then, from now on, the safety of this world would greatly increase. Even if there were more perfect worlds, if they wanted to have any ideas about this kind of world, they would definitely have to pay a huge price. And this kind of price, to a true saint, was not even comparable to opening up a perfect world. Therefore, normally speaking, as long as there was a true saint in a perfect world, even if there was only one, Then, those great worlds that had hundreds or even thousands of true saints would definitely not treat them as their own resources like how a certain true saint had treated the primordial world back then. Regarding this point, although Luo Fan couldn't be completely sure, he already had his own guesses in his heart. Through this kind of speculation and extension, he would naturally be able to obtain that the true saints of those great worlds should have some kind of rule that isolated the perfect world with true saints. There might even be some kind of rule that nurtured or competed with each other. That was why Luo Fan's words just now appeared. And according to the behavior of that living being, it was obvious that he had guessed correctly. Knowing this, Luo Fan's expression did not change, but there was an inexplicable shock in his heart. He vaguely felt that this world was deeper and more unpredictable than he had imagined. The entire chaotic state was probably countless times more lively than what he had previously known. How did you enter this perfect world? Luo Fan asked indifferently. Do you think I will tell you? The octopus-headed living being said. His eyes were filled with an indescribable mockery, as if he was looking at a beggar who was asking the king for his throne. You won't lose anything if I tell you. But if you don't say it, you might die, your Tao will disappear, and your soul will scatter. As for what to do, I think you should choose, Luo Fan said indifferently. No loss? Do you know the methods of a true saint? If I don't say it, you'll scatter my soul. I will have a chance of survival, and have a slight chance of resurrection. But if I say it, you might not deal with me. But it's very likely that I won't even have that last chance of survival. Tell me, what should I choose? That living being said indifferently. These words. This caused Luo Fan's expression to change. Although the other party still did not say the real reason, but from what he said, he already knew that the reason why the other party came to this perfect world was definitely more complicated than he had imagined. It was even possible that a true saint of the great divine refinement world was planning something. Regardless of whether it's true or not, I probably shouldn't pursue this matter anymore. Luo Fan instantly made a decision in his heart. An existence like a true saint. Even the current him was still so powerful that it made people feel despair. If he were to participate in the true saint's plan, then what awaited him would not be death, but definitely become a part of the plan. In the end, he would turn into cannon fodder, add color to the plan, and finally die without a burial place. All right, I won't ask. Luo Fan immediately said. These words caused the octopus-headed creature's eyes to reveal a look of bewilderment. He did not expect that Luo Fan would actually change his mind so easily. However, this was naturally a good thing for him. Amidst his bewilderment, he also felt a sense of relief. As for how you came here, I won't ask. However, for the normal traffic between the heavens and earth, this shouldn't be a secret, right? Luo Fan asked. This was what he wanted to know the most. The normal traffic between the heavens and earth didn't sound like much. However, this meant that there was a way to travel between the primal chaos states. If one could obtain the qualifications to enter this kind of transportation network, then the perfect world would be destroyed and destroyed. Living beings who had yet to become true saints could also use this kind of transportation network to leave the perfect world, to move to another world that still existed. In this way, it would be equivalent to obtaining true eternity. From then on, it would be eternal and indestructible. Originally, this was an ability that only true saints could have. Now, one didn't need to become true saints to obtain it. Even a fool knew what kind of opportunity this was. At this moment, Miao and the others beside Luo Fan all felt an indescribable excitement from the bottom of their hearts. They had already thought of the significance of this kind of transportation network. You want to know about the normal traffic? The creature looked at Luo Fan with a strange expression. This expression gave Luo Fan a vague sense of foreboding. However, in the end, he couldn't let go of the temptation of traveling between the many perfect worlds. He nodded and said, "That's right, I want to know about this. If you want to know, I can tell you. However, I have a condition. the creature said indifferently. What condition? Luo Fan frowned. If it wasn't for the fact that this creature came from another perfect world and gave Luo Fan an indescribable sense of danger, he would have directly searched its soul and displayed all of its memories. Why would it come here to discuss conditions with him? Of course, after a conversation with the creature, he had more or less confirmed where this sense of danger came from. It must be because of a true saint. It was extremely likely that this creature had seen a true saint before. Perhaps there was some kind of saint's imprint attached to its soul and memory. If he really went to search its soul, the final result would definitely be that he would encounter an existence related to a true saint. At that time, he might be able to escape using various methods, but he would definitely have to pay a huge price. It's very simple. I want you to let me go. Also, from now on, you can't find trouble with me in any form, the creature said. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, You really want this condition? Of course. What else do you think you have that is worth coveting? The creature said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, No problem. Since this is your condition, then I'll agree to it. He didn't ask what the creature could do, even if it let him go, since it had already sacrificed everything it had to the state of chaos. Sacrificing. It seemed like it had already lost everything, but the creature still had intelligence and could still communicate with him. This proved that it must have retained some kind of essence, and for existences at their level. As long as they retained their essence, they naturally had everything and could recover anything. Hearing Luo Fan agree, the creature heaved a sigh of relief. Then, it raised its hand and pointed in the air. Instantly, a ball of flames rushed out of its hand and condensed in the air. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into an extremely complicated and mysterious rune. This rune contained extremely profound principles and mysteries. It vaguely formed its own path. It was also vastly different from any path that Luo Fan knew. This was definitely another perfect heaven and earth, or even the great Tao of another great heaven and earth. Only such a path could give Luo Fan such a feeling. What you want to know is something that can't be described with words. Only through this imprint can you understand everything, the octopus-headed creature said. Luo Fan looked at the rune that was called an imprint. With a wave of his hand, the rune fell into his hand. However, he didn't try to sense the information contained within it. He didn't immediately understand what he wanted to know. Instead, he started to use all his means to study this rune and look at all the details of this rune. Of course, this was because he wanted to understand the mysteries of another path and strengthen his worldview. To perfect his worldview. However, more than that, he was worried about the creature. One had to know that the creature wanted to kill him before. It was even willing to sacrifice everything it had in exchange for the karmic fire that could harm him to destroy him. For such a creature to completely believe that it didn't have any negative thoughts about him and would wholeheartedly agree to this transaction without any schemes, it would simply be an insult to his intelligence. Regarding Luo Fan's behavior, the creature only had a mocking expression on its face, but it didn't say anything. This was how it should be. If Luo Fan had so easily started to look at the information contained within, he wouldn't have the slightest doubt about the possible schemes of this rune. He did not have the slightest doubt that the rune might be plotting against him. Instead, he wondered if he had been hit in the head by a pig to fall into this predicament. Luo Fan used all his means. In the end, he finally came to the conclusion that this was a safe rune. At the same time, through the study of this rune, he also learned about the mysteries of many other great Taos of the world. He faintly felt that his worldview had improved slightly. Compared to before, it was a little stronger. Let me take a look at the contents inside. This thought flashed through his mind. He seeped his perception into the rune and began to look at the various indescribable information contained in the rune. The amount of information was extremely huge. Even at this time, When Luo Fan received this information, he actually had a feeling that his head and his soul were about to be completely filled to the brim. After a long while, he finally sorted out the countless pieces of information. In an instant, his heart trembled, and a look of disbelief appeared in his eyes. This was because he discovered that the transportation network between the many perfect worlds described in the rune involved an existence that he had seen before. It was the universe of negative emotions. The universe of negative emotions was born along with the transportation network. It was an existence similar to the abyss on both sides of a cliff. In other words, the universe of negative emotions was also an existence that was born at the same time as the transportation network. Once one entered the universe of negative emotions, it was equivalent to falling into an abyss. One would never be able to reincarnate and would never be able to step into the normal chaotic state again. It was even more impossible to step into any of the perfect worlds. This universe of negative emotions was called the wild abyss in the information. Since ancient times, it was unknown how many living beings, including many true sages, had fallen into the wild abyss and never appeared again. They never appeared in front of any living beings, not even any true sages. If one wanted to step into the normal state and go to other perfect worlds, and cross the chaotic state, one would need to resist the pull of the wild abyss at all times and maintain one's state on the normal path at all times. It was an extremely subtle state that even Luo Fan needed to exhaust all of his mental strength to maintain. Even so, it was still a rather difficult state. It was fine if this was only for a short period of time. Even if it was the closest to perfect worlds, it would take at least 100 million years to communicate through this transportation network. Under such circumstances, it could be predicted that any living being, unless they were true sages, would be dreaming if they wanted to cross the chaotic state with this transportation network. Even Luo Fan was not confident that he could maintain that subtle state for a few days, let alone hundreds of millions of years. Of course, if this was the only way, then this transportation network would be useless. There was no point in its existence at all. In fact, there was a way to bypass this restriction. That was to obtain the protection of a true sage's decree. In that case, one would be able to enter the transportation network at will, travel between the many perfect worlds, and easily cross the chaotic state. Chapter 1847. On the other hand, a path blessed by a true saint's decree was a path acknowledged by the true saints of both worlds. Of course, even with such a path, one would still have to pay an unimaginable price in order to step onto it. Generally speaking, once a cultivator reached the Khanate Grand Luo level, they would already be able to create a world. Such an existence could obtain whatever he wanted through the creation of world. The only things that could truly restrain them were magic treasures of a higher level, or something that could not be created at all and could only be produced in the natural world, or something that could only exist in the primal chaos. Under such circumstances, once a cultivator reached the Khanate Grand Luo level, there would no longer be a fixed item of equivalent value. Anything could be created, and no matter how complex an item was, it would not be able to fool beings of such a level for too long. As for items that could not be created and could only be found in the chaos and the heaven and earth, or even higher-level treasures, although they could not be easily created, they had unimaginable anti-counterfeiting properties. However, their numbers were clearly insufficient to be used as a normal item of equivalent value. Precisely because of this, once a cultivator reached the Khanate Grand Luo level, the trade between them would begin to degenerate. There would no longer be the prosperous commerce of mortal civilizations. Generally speaking, the transactions between them had also turned into bartering. If that was the case for the Khanate Grand Luo realm, then the demi-saint realm, the false saint realm, the false saint realm, the despaired ones, and the supreme sovereign realm, the phenomenon would only worsen as one's realm increased. After all, the higher one's realm was, the more items they could create. Perhaps, in the Khanate Grand Luo level, A quasi-saint level treasure would be enough to exchange for all of the other party's assets and treasures. But this kind of sage-to-be level magic treasure was something that a pseudo-sage could refine with a single thought from a pseudo-sage. So on and so forth. At Luo Fan's level, apart from pseudo-origin spiritual treasures and true-origin spiritual treasures, they would only need to seek for items that came from the chaos. With that, the higher one's realm was, the lesser the need for the outside world. Naturally, it would become increasingly impossible for trade to form a commercial system. This was Luo Fan's understanding of the relationship between cultivators and business. However, at this moment, through the information given to him by that creature, he realized that perhaps he was still a frog at the bottom of a well. The reason why, in his understanding, the higher the level, the lower the demand for business, was not because this was the truth. Instead, it was because his knowledge was greatly limited. Perhaps, in the perfect world, his understanding was correct. However, it would be a huge mistake if one were to apply this kind of understanding to the world. No matter what level of existence it was, they all had a need for external help. They were existences that could not be created out of thin air. That was time. It was not the kind of time that could be stretched, shortened, or twisted at will. The years that belonged to the living beings themselves. Every living being's age was unique. They were irreplaceable. When you lose certain years, then, even if you had the ability to reverse time, even if you could travel back and forth on the axis of time at will, you would never be able to find it again. This might be difficult to understand, but if you looked at it this way, it would be very easy to understand. For example, in a certain period of time, what you experienced, what you did, and what you encountered, to you, that was the only meaning. Even if you experienced those things at other times, did those things again, or even encountered those things again, the feeling would not be exactly the same as before. Even if you did not experience those things at other times, but directly returned to that period of time through rebirth and experienced those things again, the feeling would not be the same as before. And this period of experience was time. In the big world, time was a kind of general equivalent. If you wanted to get anything, you could use time to pay for it. If you wanted to sell something, you could also get some time. If you wanted to step on the path that was blessed by the true sage talisman, you would have to pay the price of time. Only by paying the price of time could you step on any path that was blessed by the true sage talisman and cross the chaotic state. There was also a price list among the information. There were countless large worlds in the chaotic state. Among them, if you wanted to step on the path between the two nearest large worlds, you would have to pay the price of 100 billion years. 100 billion years. Luo Fan looked at it and could not help but smile inexplicably. Time might be extremely important to other cultivators. Whether they obtained or lost it, it meant a lot. However, it was nothing to him at all. That was because his current senses had already surpassed time. For him, there was no difference between 100 billion years and a moment, and there was no difference between a moment and 100 billion years. In this way, even if he lost an infinite amount of time, it would be equivalent to losing an instant. Even if he obtained an instant, it would be equivalent to obtaining an infinite amount of time. Under such circumstances, this mode of transportation was simply custom-made for him. I need to understand the feeling of exchanging time. Let's exchange some time, Luo Fan said calmly to that living being. Even though the information clearly explained what time was and what its value was, it was still just a theory on paper, after all. What would it feel like to gain and lose time? Was it really as he had guessed? Would it really affect him very little? But he still needed to confirm it. Hearing this, that living being looked at Luo Fan and said, "There's no need to exchange. You can obtain the time you want. Since it's a common item of equivalent value, it can naturally be stored. I happen to have some time left here, so I'll give you some. If you want to experience the feeling of losing time, it's very simple. You can just send some time into it." After saying this, the octopus-headed living being stretched out its hand and grabbed. Its palm had already penetrated the space-time dimensional fragment and entered an extremely obscure place that even surpassed Luo Fan's sensing ability. With a slight tug, it had already taken out a round plate. This round plate was only the size of a palm and had two smooth sides. However, it didn't reflect light at all. Staring at it felt like staring at a black hole, as if even one's gaze was about to be sucked in. The octopus-headed living being threw the item at Luo Fan and said, "I don't have any use for this thing at the moment, so I'll give it to you." Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and raised his hand to receive the round plate. The moment he received the round plate, he instantly knew how to use it. Although this round plate was amazing, it wasn't a very high-level magic treasure. However, it was not a very high-level magic treasure. When it fell into Luo Fan's hands, he did not even need to analyze it at all. Just by the touch of his palm, he had completely understood the effect of this disc in an instant. He even knew how to refine it. There's actually no concealment at all. Instead, it even has a magical effect that makes it easier for others to understand. It's really extraordinary. Luo Fan sensed the various effects of this round plate and couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. The reason why he was able to understand the various magical effects of this round plate so easily, apart from the fact that Luo Fan himself was powerful, apart from the fact that his realm was high, more importantly, this round plate was set up in such a way. It was to prevent any creatures from obstructing its use as much as possible. At this moment, the octopus-headed living being looked at Luo Fan with an inquisitive and expectant look in his eyes. This kind of look, even ordinary people could see that he was looking forward to Luo Fan making a fool of himself next. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression was indifferent. With a slight thought, he used his own understanding just now to grab an invisible and intangible existence from the round plate. After this shapeless and intangible existence appeared, it shook slightly. It had already sunk into Luo Fan's body. In an instant, an indescribable feeling emerged in his heart. In a trance, Luo Fan seemed to feel that he had completely turned into a different person. A person with the same strength as him, but regardless of mentality. His thoughts, perception, worldview, and so on, they were all fundamentally different from him. Is this the feeling of obtaining someone else's time? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he comprehended this state at this moment. The time he took out from the round plate just now was only a few days. Normally, this kind of feeling, even for the octopus-headed living being, would only be a short instant. It wouldn't make them feel too much. But Luo Fan was different. At this time, he could equate an instant with 1,000,000,000 trillion years. For him, these few days were enough for him to integrate everything in his body with this completely different mentality and thoughts. He vaguely understood many of the omissions in his worldview and felt that there were some places that could be modified and improved. In this way, when he broke away from this time, he found that his understanding of the worldview had deepened by another level, and his cultivation realm seemed to have improved a little. It's actually only been a moment. After coming back to his senses, he was slightly surprised. Although he felt that several days had passed, in reality, it had only been a short moment since he had received the time clock. What a wonderful time! In an instant, he knew what was going on and couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. At this time, he completely understood what kind of process it was to obtain someone else's time. It was to seize everything from someone else for a certain period of time and put one's own will into it to cultivate, experience, or do other things for fun. During this process, the will of the living being itself wouldn't be affected at all. It would still be the same will, the same memories, but the mentality and other aspects would become the same as the living being who paid the time. Such a difference was definitely enough for a cultivator to have a completely different understanding of their own cultivation path. Through this transformation, they would be able to understand themselves from a different perspective. Then, they would obtain a special kind of harvest, which would eventually turn into a push for their cultivation realm, allowing their cultivation realm to improve. This was the magical effect of time on cultivation. Apart from this, perhaps there was another magical effect that the cultivators cared about. That was to cleanse one's heart of longevity through this transformation. For example, a living being that had lived for an unknown number of trillions of years. A cultivator whose heart of longevity was already covered in dust and no longer had any attachment to life. If one could obtain the mentality of a living being that had just obtained longevity or was born not too long ago, then perhaps one's heart would be cleansed and their heart of longevity would return to its original clarity. What a wondrous effect this was! The octopus creature looked at Luo Fan and chuckled. Now, do you want to try and see what it feels like to lose your time? At this time, the anticipation in his eyes became even more intense. Luo Fan faintly smiled. With a thought, he used the disc to send several days of his time into it. At this moment, a feeling of loss suddenly emerged from the bottom of his heart. In a trance, he seemed to have lost a memory of an unknown number of years, as if a certain period of time had been separated from his body. No matter how he calculated and how he sensed, it seemed that his time had been cut off at a certain location and had only been reconnected a few days ago. An indescribable feeling of irritation suddenly enveloped him, causing his aura to become unstable. An inexplicable and powerful pressure suddenly pressed down on the people around him. This caused the expressions of the surrounding air maidens to change slightly. In fact, they weren't the only ones who felt it just now. At this moment, all the living beings in the entire space-time dimension felt as if a great disaster was about to befall them, as if the entire space-time dimension was about to collapse and step into doomsday. The entire space-time dimension began to tremble slightly. This tremor was not as strong as the tremor caused by the battle between Luo Fan and the Lord of the Restricted Area. However, the shock it brought to the many living beings in the space-time dimension was many times stronger than before. There was no other reason for this. This slight tremor seemed to make the entire space-time dimension tremble in fear. Although the octopus-headed living being felt extremely uncomfortable, an excited look appeared on his face. He laughed out loud. Ha ha! Do you know what it feels like to lose time? When I lost time for the first time, it took me several years to vent my emotions before I could eliminate the feeling of loss in my heart. Come on. Let me see how long you want to vent. Come on, let it all out. Destroy everything you care about. Ha ha! Just as the living being was laughing heartily, Luo Fan's expression suddenly changed, and the irritation on his face completely disappeared. His eyes had completely regained their clarity, as if nothing had happened. As for the unstable aura on his body, it was completely restrained. All the living beings in the space-time dimension and the space-time dimension instantly relaxed. At this moment, waves of impact erupted everywhere in the space-time dimension. Instead, it caused the space-time dimension to tremble even more intensely than before. However, this tremor was no longer as oppressive or fearful as before. There was only an indescribable sense of relief, as if it could finally be released after being suppressed for a long time. The waves of impact that erupted everywhere in the space-time dimension were none other than the resistance that the living beings had released to resist the aura. Due to the sudden restraint of the aura suddenly erupted. It was also at this moment that the living beings regained their ability to think. What happened just now? How could there be such a terrifying aura? I thought I was going to die just now. One of the living beings exclaimed in horror. This terrifying thought that was transmitted everywhere didn't receive any reply. Obviously, the living beings had already guessed what was going on. How is this possible? At this moment, in the forbidden area of the stone forest, the octopus-headed living being's face was full of disbelief. His eyes were filled with disbelief as he opened his mouth and let out a loud cry. The way he looked at Luo Fan was as if he was looking at something that was completely beyond his understanding. Where was the joy and excitement from before in his expression? Even if it's just a moment of time, you'll need at least a few years to regain your sanity. Why did you only do it for a moment? How could such a thing happen? I don't believe it. I don't believe it. At this moment, he was almost a little hysterical. This was because what Luo Fan had done had overturned his worldview. Based on his understanding, other than a true divine who was unfathomably powerful and could ignore the negative feeling of losing time, no other living being could do this. Although Luo Fan didn't completely ignore this negative feeling, it was not much different from truly ignoring it. How could he accept this? Luo Fan couldn't be bothered to pay attention to him at this moment. He just raised his hand and held the intangible time in his hand with an inexplicable expression on his face. If his perspective hadn't transcended time and could equate a moment with billions of trillion years, he definitely wouldn't have been able to get rid of the negative feelings so easily and regain his sanity. Chapter 1848. The Space Maiden didn't say anything when she saw this, and she casually received the shapeless and immaterial existence. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable aura surged out from her body. In a trance, it was as if the level of her thoughts had increased by countless times. It was as if nothing in the universe could escape her senses. This process only lasted for a moment. However, at this moment, whether it was Wu Miao, the 8 followers behind her, Qing Longzi, or the octopus-headed creature in the ball of fire in Luo Fan's hand, all of them felt an indescribable fear from the bottom of their hearts. It was like all of his secrets, all of his desires, all of the things that he hid deeply and didn't want others to know about were instantly seen through by the Space Maiden. This power of observation. How is this possible? At this moment, Qing Longzi felt an indescribable shock in his heart. As a disciple of a true saint, his understanding of the true saint surpassed everyone else here. It was precisely because of this that he possessed an understanding that was 100 times more accurate than Wu Miao and the others when it came to the observation ability and comprehension ability displayed by Space Maiden at this moment. Although this can't be compared to a true saint, it's only one level lower. How can a lone cultivator do this? This was what Qing Longzi was thinking at this moment. With this thought, the way she looked at Luo Fan had completely changed. Before this, when she looked at Luo Fan, it was equivalent to looking at someone who was more powerful than her. But now, when she looked at Luo Fan, it was as if she was looking at an unbelievable existence who was about to become a true saint. After a moment, the Air Maiden let out a long breath. I've had a great realization now. I'm afraid I can't travel with you guys anymore. She sighed and said to Luo Fan. At this moment, there were all kinds of lights flashing in her eyes. One could faintly see that there was a world that was different from any other. A world view in any time and space. It was obvious that she had had a great realization. She was even on the verge of a breakthrough. Seeing this, Luo Fan was stunned for a moment, then he was overjoyed. Could it be that he was about to touch the Great Tribulation? He said, if that's the case, then you can cultivate in seclusion there. The air hostess naturally knew what Luo Fan was talking about. She smiled and nodded. At this moment, Luo Fan waved his hand. Air hostess instantly stepped into his body. It was as if she had completely merged with his body and disappeared without a trace. Wu Miao and the others knew that the air hostess had entered a world or space-time that Luo Fan didn't want them to see. Although they were surprised, they weren't too curious. Only Luo Fan knew that at this moment, the Space Maiden had already stepped into a certain world within the innate inextinguishable spirit light. If it was in front of others, he naturally wouldn't mind revealing the connate inextinguishable spirit light and letting the Sky Maiden step into the connate inextinguishable spirit light. But he couldn't do that here. This was because there was not only a true sage disciple like Qing Longzi here, but also a cultivator from the great God refining heaven and earth. These two people's origins were not simple. He wasn't sure what the other party's attitude would be after seeing that he had the connate inextinguishable spirit light. Even if he was confident that he could suppress them, he didn't want to cause unnecessary trouble. He was looking for trouble. I didn't expect to be able to break through after only having you for 3 days. It seems that your realm is higher than I imagined. At this moment, the octopus-headed creature said. Hearing this, Meow and the others seemed to have woken up from a dream. There was an indescribable look in their eyes. The way they looked at Luo Fan also changed. Just by looking at their expressions at this moment, Luo Fan had almost turned into a giant pill at this moment. What, you've come back to your senses? Luo Fan just smiled faintly. He said, I've come back to my senses. For your 3 days of time to have such an effect, it makes sense that you were able to get rid of that negative feeling so quickly. The octopus head sighed. The octopus-headed creature sighed. Hearing this, Luo Fan said indifferently, I want to know. Since you've told me, then our deal is over. After saying that, he didn't bother to say anything else. He casually threw the ball of flames in his hand into the stone forest in front of him. It sank into the depths of the stone forest and disappeared in front of him. Back then, he had caught this creature in the depths of the stone forest. Now that he was letting it go, he naturally released it into the depths of the stone forest. Even if the stone forest was worlds apart from the stone forest's forbidden zone, it wouldn't change his decision. The creature seemed to be in disbelief that Luo Fan would actually let it go so easily. When it was thrown out, its eyes were still filled with disbelief. After a long time, when Luo Fan and the others finally turned around and left, it finally reacted. It turned out that it had already obtained its freedom and escaped. In an instant, its gaze became extremely complicated. After a long time, it sent a voice transmission to Luo Fan. I know that you want to use the chaotic transportation to leave this world, but I advise you not to leave through the path blessed by the true divine decree. These words made Luo Fan slightly stunned. He turned around and asked, why? Although he wasn't sure that he would leave through the path blessed by the true divine decree, it was, after all, safer. His heart was inclined to leave through the path blessed by the true divine decree. Once you leave that path and become a true divine, you will never be able to leave again, the creature with the octopus head said. After saying that, there was no more movement. In a flash, it had already disappeared from Luo Fan's senses. At this moment, although Luo Fan still wanted to continue asking, he also knew that the creature had no interest in talking. He could only sigh, thank it, and leave. The fact that the other party was willing to say those last words was already a huge favor. If the other party were to continue to force the other party, then he would really be a little ignorant of his limits. However, why is that? If I step on the path blessed by the true divine decree, I will never be able to become a true divine again? Is there really such a thing? Luo Fan's heart was filled with all kinds of thoughts, and he couldn't help but frown. This kind of words seemed to be very ridiculous, but he didn't think that the creature was lying to him. There was no evidence for this. However, his intuition told him that what the creature said was very likely to be the truth. He thought about it in his heart. In the end, he still couldn't figure out what the problem was. In the end, Luo Fan could only put this question at the bottom of his heart. This kind of thing that involved a true divine was still a level away from him. Even if his realm had been raised to this level, it was still too far for him to study in this aspect. What did it say to you just now? Meow asked curiously. The voice transmission just now was extremely restrained. Even Meow couldn't hear it at all. Furthermore, Luo Fan's reaction after hearing the voice transmission was very different. She couldn't help but be curious. She couldn't help but be shocked at what the creature had said. Luo Fan listened. Seeing that Luo Fan wasn't willing to say more, Meow naturally knew that she couldn't ask any more. At that moment, just as she was about to speak, the entire space-time dimension suddenly underwent an earth-shattering change. Just as he was about to speak, the entire space-time dimension underwent an earth-shattering change. Amidst these vibrations, all kinds of earth-shattering sounds rapidly erupted from everywhere. It started to shake the entire space-time dimension. Amidst the tremors, earth-shattering noises erupted from all directions, causing the entire space-time dimension to tremble. Various kinds of earth-shattering sounds rapidly erupted from everywhere. It started to shake the entire space-time dimension. Every part started to produce all kinds of changes that were completely different from the other parts. In a trance, this space-time dimension seemed to have become more than 30 completely different space-time dimensions. They took the initiative to activate the Forbidden Zone. Qing Longzi was the most familiar with the space-time dimension. In an instant, he discovered what exactly was going on. Hearing this, Wu Miao was first stunned. Then, she said unhappily, they actually took the initiative to activate the Forbidden Zone. How can they do this? How are we going to investigate them one by one? Hearing this, the 8 followers behind her all revealed bitter smiles. Waiting for us to investigate one by one? Let us take them down one by one? This kind of thing, even an ordinary person would not do, let alone this kind of peerless expert who could create such a thing. For them to be able to endure until now before activating the Forbidden Zone, it could even be said to be admirable. They admired their willpower. What a pity. They actually took the initiative to activate these Forbidden Zones now. I originally thought that they would only activate them after a few more. Luo Fan sighed slightly at this moment. In this situation, it was clear that the masters of the Forbidden Zones saw that their methods were too powerful and that they couldn't resist at all. Fear arose in their hearts. Before their many Forbidden Zones were completely prepared, they had activated them, causing these Forbidden Zones to completely lose their original form. This caused them to be unable to continue to investigate these Forbidden Zones without fear. It is indeed a pity. Qing Longzi sighed at this moment. However, it was very clear that what she felt was a pity and what Luo Fan felt were two completely different things. Luo Fan felt a pity for those Forbidden Zones that had lost their original form. He could no longer completely understand the essence of each Forbidden Zone like he did when he dealt with the other Forbidden Zones before and obtained some unexpected gains. Qing Longzi felt a pity for this space-time dimension. Once any Forbidden Zone was activated wantonly, it could cause the entire space-time dimension to be completely destroyed. The reason why none of the forbidden areas had been completely activated before, other than the fact that they hadn't been fully prepared and that every forbidden area wouldn't be able to achieve their goal once they were activated, was because there were more than one forbidden area. There were conflicts between any two forbidden areas, and once they were activated, the other forbidden areas would be the first to be triggered. Not only would they not be able to achieve the result they wanted, it was more likely that a war would break out between the forbidden areas. This balance allowed the space-time dimension to have so many forbidden zones, but it was still stable and not destroyed. However, this situation had changed after the arrival of Luo Fan and the others. This was because Luo Fan and the others' unbridled destruction of the Forbidden Zones had finally caused the owners of the Forbidden Zones to panic. They knew that if they continued to wait like this, they would become pigs and sheep waiting to be slaughtered. They would be waiting for their opponents to destroy them one by one, causing the Forbidden Zones that they had built for countless years to crumble without any value. Destruction. Hence, they had no choice but to activate the Forbidden Zones when they were unprepared. Although they couldn't achieve their ultimate goal, they were still Forbidden Zones after all. Once they were activated, they would still be of help to themselves and more or less obtain some gains. This was compared to not obtaining anything at all. For the entire Forbidden Zone to be destroyed, it was already much stronger. This was also because Luo Fan was simply too powerful. All the living creatures in the space-time dimension couldn't even think of resisting him. They didn't have the confidence to fight him at all. Luo Fan and the others were very meticulous in their thinking and naturally understood their mentality in an instant. At this moment they all sighed. At this moment, an abstract door suddenly appeared in the void. This abstract door appeared above the space-time dimension. It allowed all the living creatures in the space-time dimension to directly see the existence of this door. However, it wasn't like before, where only the living creatures that attacked this door could sense and see the existence of this abstract door. This situation finally diverted the attention of Luo Fan and the others from the changes in the forbidden zones. "What's going on?" Miao exclaimed. This situation was something she had never thought of. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "This must be caused by the drastic changes in the space-time dimension caused by those forbidden zones. It seems like we can't continue to stay in this space-time dimension." This abstract door itself was naturally condensed because of the countless powerhouses after the space-time dimension had been established for countless years. It was the result of the transformation of the distance between this space-time dimension and the higher space-time dimension. Its foundation was obviously this space-time dimension and the higher space-time dimension. At this moment, the earth-shattering changes in this space-time dimension had obviously shaken one of the two foundations. Under such circumstances, how could there be no changes to this abstract portal? The reason why it could appear now. It didn't completely collapse because although this space-time dimension had undergone a drastic change, it still hadn't collapsed or perished. However, this was only temporary. The conflict between the many forbidden zones was really too great. Many of them had completely opposite changes to the space-time dimension. Once they really came into contact with each other, the impact that would erupt would be absolutely terrifying and absolutely unimaginable. Therefore, it could be predicted. Although this space-time dimension was still considered complete at this moment, it was only a matter of time before it was completely torn apart. And apparently so. Once this space-time dimension was torn apart, this door would obviously no longer exist. She understood all of this. Miao couldn't help but become extremely nervous. Then what are we waiting for? Hurry up and go. Compared to Luo Fan and the others who entered the higher space-time dimension to see more scenery, Miao entered the higher space-time dimension to go home. Of course, this kind of urgency was completely different. At this moment, Luo Fan's brows were already furrowed. Without any hesitation, he lifted his foot and took a light stride, bringing everyone through who knew how many space-time dimensions they had to go through, directly arriving in front of the abstract door. This abstract door was incomparably huge, incomparably sturdy, and incomparably powerful. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to block countless living beings for so many years. When Luo Fan and the others appeared in front of this door, they were like a few ants appearing in front of a star. The degree of their insignificance was simply unimaginable. Small. Luo Fan frowned as he looked at this huge door and uttered this word. This word wasn't too loud, and it didn't seem to be too imposing. It also didn't seem to contain any power at all. However, just this one word was enough to make the abstract door start to tremble slightly. Then, it gradually began to shrink, round and round and round and round in just a short span of a few breaths. The door that seemed like ants in front of a star had already shrunk to a height of less than 30 feet. Looking at this scene, Miao didn't feel anything, but the 8 followers behind her already had their mouths wide open, unable to close them at all. As existences who had cultivated in this space-time dimension for so many years, they understood the terror of this abstract door better than Miao and the others. In the past, there was no lack of living beings attacking this abstract door. However, in their memories, even the strongest of them could only touch this door with their hands before they couldn't withstand the terrifying power transmitted by this door. Their bodies collapsed, and their souls were destroyed. How could anyone be like Luo Fan, who scolded this door as if it was a lackey? Moreover, this door actually took the initiative to change after being scolded like this. That was even more ridiculous. Amidst this shock, an inexplicable joy began to appear in their hearts, and their expressions became excited. With this method, perhaps it would be extremely easy for them to open this door and step into the other side. At this moment, Luo Fan wasn't thinking about what they would do. Although it was his first time coming into contact with this kind of abstract door, his understanding of the essence of abstraction surpassed almost all existences. Naturally, he clearly knew that as long as he changed his perspective, abstract objects could change into any form at will. Even this abstract door was no exception. Chapter 1849. Looking at the 30-meter-tall door in front of him, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and pressed his hands directly on the door. In an instant, an indescribable shock spread out from the door and swept through his entire body. It even transmitted to his life source, making him feel as if everything in him was shaking along with this shock. This shock was extremely mysterious, and its power was extremely terrifying. His view of the world was actually being shaken. His life essence and his body felt like they were going to completely collapse and perish in the face of this turbulence. At this moment, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and steadied his mind. His life source trembled slightly, and an invisible potential was released from his life source in an instant. In an instant, it swept through his entire body and completely enveloped the place that was enveloped by the shock. This kind of potential was extremely mysterious and profound, and it also contained the profound truth of the worldview. In this instant it produced the most direct and most tragic conflict with the shock. Amidst this direct and bitter conflict, countless terrifying sounds could be faintly heard coming from his body. It was as if there were countless worlds continuously opening and destroying in his body in a trance. These various sounds continued for a long time before gradually subsiding. When everything calmed down, Luo Fan was no longer any different from his normal state. He was still as relaxed and calm as before. With a slight push, the abstract door had already slowly opened. As the abstract door opened, countless passages and forks appeared behind the door. They appeared in front of everyone. "This is the path to the other side?" At this moment, countless creatures exclaimed. Among them, the ones who reacted the most violently were Miao's 8 followers. At this moment, the 8 followers' breathing became much heavier, and their eyes that were staring at the door in front of them became even redder. They looked as if they couldn't help but rush out and crash into the door. However, very soon, the scene behind the door was completely revealed, completely imprinted in the eyes of everyone present. This caused the scene to fall silent. In the end, which path is the correct one? This thought instantly appeared in the minds of many living beings. However, even with such doubts, Lin Yun still felt a little doubtful. Despite this hesitation, many creatures with abilities began to quickly rush over from all directions of the space-time dimension towards this location. No matter who opened the door, in short, the door was already open. Their chance had come. Compared to stepping into the higher space-time dimension and stepping onto the other side, everything in this space-time dimension was secondary. They could all be abandoned. Even. They were the lords of the restricted zones. At this time, there were also a few who directly abandoned their own forbidden areas and escaped. He quickly rushed towards where Luo Fan and the others were, which was also the location of this abstract portal. All of a sudden, the entire space-time dimension was filled with countless rays of light. Waves of aura began to rapidly converge from all directions towards this location. It was also at this moment that Miao and the others truly discovered the life forms in this space-time dimension. There were so many of them. That's at least a few trillion. Miao mumbled as he watched the scene unfold before him. "Let's go." Luo Fan didn't care about anything else. He just said to Miao and the others. As he spoke, he had already stepped into the abstract door. Although Miao and the others didn't know which path to choose and which fork to take, none of them objected to Luo Fan's choice. Instead, they directly stepped into the portal and followed closely behind Luo Fan, quickly walking towards one of the many paths. At this time, Luo Fan didn't hesitate at all. Without any doubt, he stepped towards one of the countless paths with a clear goal. In the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared behind the portal with everyone. As they disappeared, the abstract portal began to slowly close. Clearly, this portal was opened by Luo Fan. After Luo Fan left, this portal would no longer remain open. However, there was still a period of time before it completely closed. This period of time was enough for many creatures to charge in. In the beginning, those who followed behind Luo Fan and rushed into the abstract portal were the lords of the restricted areas. After that, there were many creatures that were equivalent to level 3 Supreme Emperors. After that, the weaker creatures wouldn't have the chance to do so. After the level 3 Supreme Emperor level beings rushed in, the door finally closed up completely and was tightly sealed in front of everyone's eyes. No. Mournful cries rang out in front of the abstract door. For a moment, countless creatures began to attack this abstract portal without any regard for their lives. Previously, even Luo Fan had to endure the test of this portal in order to open it. He had to endure the terrifying tremors that could even shake the origin of life. How could these creatures be exempted from this test? For a moment, countless creatures' bodies and minds collapsed under the test of this abstract portal. They directly turned into the tiniest space-time dimensional fragments and disappeared from the space-time dimension. If it was in the past, this would have been the case. No matter how unwilling those creatures were, they would definitely consider the odds and make a choice. In the end, most of them would leave this portal and return to their cave abodes to cultivate again. However, it was clear that this was not a normal time. At this time, the entire space-time dimension had fallen into the chaos of the restricted area. It was about to be completely torn apart, and this portal was about to disappear. Even if they could withstand the destruction caused by this space-time dimension being torn apart and preserve their lives, they would never have the chance to see this abstract portal again. They would never have the chance to step behind this portal and head to a higher space-time dimension again. Under such circumstances, even if they knew that the chances were extremely low, they knew that if they continued, there was a higher chance that they would collapse, die, and lose their lives. They had no choice but to continue. For a moment, countless creatures frantically bombarded the abstract portal with their attacks. At the same time, an unknown number of living beings were completely destroyed by the feedback of this bombardment, and were completely annihilated. Just like that, the space-time dimensional fragments around the abstract portal seemed to turn into thick smoke and began to pour in all directions. They gradually began to fall down. The scene was unimaginably tragic. This process lasted for several hours. When the abstract portal completely collapsed, when they disappeared, there were only a few thousand of the trillions of living beings around the abstract gate. These thousands of creatures. At this time, their mental state was completely different from before. If it was said that they were fanatical and expectant at the beginning, then now, they had already become numb. Their eyes had become lifeless and lifeless. At this time, the entire space-time dimension had been completely torn apart by the many restricted areas. From the original complete space-time dimension, it had turned into more than 30 huge space-time dimensional fragments. Only a few of the space-time dimensional fragments still had creatures living in them. Most of the space-time dimensional fragments were already like the restricted areas. There were no longer any traces of life. In other words, in just a few hours, this place had existed for an unknown number of years. The space-time dimension that had hundreds of billions of creatures living in it had completely disappeared. At least 90% of the creatures inside had died. It was so terrifying, so cruel, and so tragic. It was really a pity. However, all of this wasn't a problem for Luo Fan and the others at all. Although the creatures that followed Luo Fan and the others into the abstract door were only a very small part of the many creatures that were rushing over, they were still able to see through the door. However, their absolute number had already reached hundreds of thousands. However, compared to the number of creatures in the passage behind the portal, it was still insignificant. In terms of quantity, it was still an insignificant amount. Entering it was really like a drop of water falling into the sea. It couldn't be found no matter how hard one tried. Among the many creatures, there was no lack of those with strong eyesight. They could see the path that Luo Fan and the others had chosen. Once someone saw someone stepping into that path, the other creatures would naturally step into that path one after another. Hence, at least for now, all the hundreds of thousands of creatures had already followed behind Luo Fan and stepped into that path with him. However, this was clearly only temporary. When they finally encountered the second fork in the path, those creatures finally couldn't continue following Luo Fan's footstep. The second fork in the path also had countless densely packed passages in front of them. Compared to the first fork in the road, there wasn't much of a difference at all. It was also endless, and it was also impossible for the hundreds of thousands of creatures to find a trace after entering it. We can only try our luck. At this moment, the expressions of those creatures were filled with helplessness and apprehension. To find the correct path among the countless passages that Luo Fan had passed through before, even if the creatures here were incomparably powerful, the probability was still extremely small, to the point that it was almost impossible. Hence, without any guidance, they could only resign themselves to their fate and start to casually choose the path that they felt was the best. Not long after, there were no longer any creatures at the fork in the path. One by one, they dispersed into the countless passageways and advanced according to their own senses. Although Luo Fan sensed the choices made by the creatures behind him, he didn't have any intention of paying attention to them. For him, choosing the right direction to move forward was not an easy task. Although he had the aura of the higher space-time dimension's lifeform that had fallen from the higher space-time dimension as a guide, leading him to the correct path at every fork, this place was simply too far away from the higher space-time dimension. The resonance between the aura and the higher space-time dimension was simply too weak. As such, even he had to focus all his attention on sensing it. Only by making a choice would he be able to find the correct path. Under such circumstances, how could he be distracted and care about the lives of those people behind him? This fork would appear almost every once in a while. And every time there was a fork, there would be an endless number of paths waiting for him to choose. Among these countless paths, there was only one that could lead to the true higher space-time dimension and step into Wamiao's home. Those people have taken the wrong path. Where will they end up? One day he asked. One day, Qing Longzi sighed and asked Wamiao. At this moment, she clearly wanted to ask about Luo Fan. However, evidently Luo Fan, who was focused on sensing the aura and searching for the path, had no time to care about her. Hence, she could only settle for the next best thing and ask Wamiao. When Wamiao heard this, she was stunned. Immediately after, she said, "Who knows? However, I think it's most likely. They should be heading to a space-time dimension similar to the one before." A space-time dimension similar to the one before. Qing Longzi's expression relaxed. No matter what, Wamiao was a life form from the higher space-time dimension. Furthermore, she was already an existence that had traveled a long distance on the path of cultivation in the higher space-time dimension. Her judgment of the space-time dimension was clearly more accurate than Qing Longzi's. Qing Longzi naturally believed in her judgment. Although this is equivalent to doing useless work and starting from scratch, it's still much better than completely dying. This thought flashed through her mind. Although this is equivalent to doing useless work and starting from the beginning, it is still much better than completely dying. Such a thought flashed through her mind. She wanted to find transcendence and a path to the higher space-time dimension. However, it's still much better than completely dying. This thought flashed through her mind. She was not completely indifferent to the life forms in the higher space-time dimension. She wanted to find a way to the higher space-time dimension. The other life forms also wanted to find this way and such a path. This naturally made her feel sympathetic towards them as fellow sufferers. This feeling made her somewhat unable to bear to see them die just like that. Of course, this kind of unbearable feeling could not suppress her own path. Just like now, where she could casually worry about the life forms, she naturally would not be stingy with worrying about them. However, if her worrying about them affected her own path and her own transcendence, she would definitely become stone-hearted. She would not invest even the slightest bit of emotion in them. They kept walking and stopping like this. After walking for more than 100 years, the number of forks in the road that they had passed through was so many that they couldn't even count them. On this day, Luo Fan finally stopped. He stopped moving non-stop for more than 100 years. In front of him, where there should have been forks in the road, there were no longer countless forks in the road. Instead, there was light. A boundless, incomparably intense, incomparably dazzling light that even obscured one's field of vision, blinding everyone and making them unable to see anything. Can you feel it? Luo Fan turned and asked Wamiao. At this moment, Wamiao's expression had changed inexplicably. She seemed nervous, expectant, excited, unfamiliar, and yet familiar. All sorts of expressions piled up on her face, displaying a strange state. This went on for a long time. Suddenly, her eyes lit up and she said, "I found it. It's here. This is the higher space-time dimension." As she spoke, tears flowed down her cheeks unknowingly. "I'm finally back," she murmured. She opened her arms as if she was embracing the entire light, embracing the mysterious space-time dimension behind it. At this moment, the 8 followers of Wamiao were all extremely shocked and excited. Their anticipation for the higher space-time dimension was no less than Wamiao's. At this moment, after trekking for more than 100 years and crossing countless forks, they had finally arrived at their destination. The feeling, the shock, and the joy they felt was self-explanatory. At this moment, Qing Longzi urged, "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go in?" As she spoke, she was about to step forward. Luo Fan smiled at this time, stopped her, and said, "Going in directly like this is too high profile. We have to use another way to step into it." "Another method?" Qing Longzi's expression was one of astonishment. Entering like this was too high profile. She agreed with this point. After all, directly breaking through the space-time dimension to enter would definitely cause some kind of change in the space-time dimension. There might even be some kind of huge phenomenon. Although this did not satisfy her, it was unavoidable. No matter what method they used, they would still crash into it. The phenomenon would definitely appear. How could there be any other way to avoid such a change? It was precisely because of this that she did not take this problem to heart. Since there was no way to solve it, what was the point of thinking about it? Now that she heard Luo Fan's words, she suddenly felt an indescribable hope. Perhaps he really has a way? This thought made her stop in her tracks. Luo Fan did not waste any more words. He smiled slightly, grabbed at something, and released it. A door appeared in front of him. It was a dimensional door that Wamiao was extremely familiar with. This door can connect to the higher space-time dimension? Wamiao's face was full of disbelief. Although the dimensional door could connect to many space-time dimensions, it obviously had its limit. The higher space-time dimension was like a natural moat compared to ordinary dimensions. It had already far exceeded the limits of the dimensional gate. This was also the reason why they couldn't use the dimensional gate to directly enter the higher space-time dimension. Instead, they had to walk through the abstract gate. Chapter 1850. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Naturally, it's possible here." These words completely answered Wamiao's question. Since it was possible here, it naturally meant that it was not possible in other places. As for why it was possible in other places, it was obviously because of the distance. The difference between other space-time dimensions and this higher space-time dimension was unimaginably huge. Naturally, this dimensional gate could not be crossed or communicated with. However, in this place, there was only a layer of light between the higher space-time dimension and the higher space-time dimension. If one wanted to communicate with the higher spacetime dimension, the difference would not be too great. Naturally, it was possible. Of course, all of this was just Luo Fan's own guess. Logically speaking, there should not be any problems. However, if there were any problems, it would not be something surprising. Hearing this, Wen Miao came to a sudden realization. An indescribable joy appeared in her eyes. An indescribable expression of relief appeared on the face of the green dragon's son. If they could enter with a low profile, it would naturally be better to do so. Luo Fan did not wait for them to say anything. At this moment, he had already taken action. He directly set up the dimensional gate in front of him. Immediately after, with a thought, endless power began to slowly pour into the dimensional gate. Activating the dimensional gate wasn't an easy task. Perhaps, in other spacetime dimensions, one only needed a thought to cross other spacetime dimensions. The power of the dimensional gate itself would be enough to allow one to cross spacetime dimensions. However, in the higher spacetime dimensions, the situation would definitely be different. In order to prevent any accidents from happening, it was necessary to use the safest method. Obviously, for the current Luo Fan, using his own power to activate the dimensional gate was the safest method. Using his own power to open the dimensional gate was obviously the safest method. As the endless and terrifying power continued to pour into the dimensional gate began to emit cracking sounds. It was as if some kind of strange machine was starting to operate within it. Immediately after, an indescribable wave was emitted from the dimensional gate and began to drill into the spacetime dimensions. It spread toward many spacetime dimensions, as if it was locking onto a certain spacetime dimension. This kind of searching and locking process was extremely difficult and troublesome. Even with the help of Luo Fan's power, this kind of fluctuation still couldn't be fixed for a long time. They still couldn't catch the high spacetime dimension in front of them that was only separated by a light curtain. This process lasted for several days. The power consumed during this process. It was so much so that it was enough for Luo Fan to destroy millions and millions of worlds. However, the dimensional gate was still the same as before. It continued to emit crackling noises and the power continued to seep into the spacetime dimension. Just as Wen Miao and Qing Longzi were getting anxious, Luo Fan's eyes suddenly narrowed and a hint of joy flashed through them. Immediately after, the undulations released by the dimensional gate in front of him suddenly condensed, before converging in an indescribable direction. Finally it was fixed. As the undulations settled down, all sorts of movements could be heard from within the dimensional gate. It completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Following this change, even the 8 followers behind Wen Miao knew that the dimensional gate had already locked onto the higher dimensional space, let alone Wen Miao and Qing Longzi. I've finally locked onto it. I didn't expect it to be so troublesome even though it's so close. Luo Fan sighed, a faint look of joy on his face. Although it took him a few days to lock onto the higher dimensional space, during this process, Luo Fan had also reaped huge benefits. Not only could he enter a specific location in the higher dimensional space through the dimensional gate, but also because, through this process of searching and locking onto the higher dimensional space, he had already engraved the coordinates of the higher dimensional space into the dimensional gate. From today onwards, no matter what spacetime dimension he was in, no matter what world he was in, he would be able to step into the higher dimensional space through the dimensional gate. Of course, he could also step into any other lower dimensional space from the higher dimensional space at will. This kind of benefit was unimaginably huge. It could be said that this alone was enough to save him tens of thousands of years of hard work every time he stepped into the higher dimensional space. However, there was naturally no need to talk about these benefits at this time. Therefore, at this time, he just smiled and directly pushed open the dimensional gate. Although he had locked onto the higher dimensional space, he obviously still had to choose the specific location. Luo Fan had never stepped into the higher dimensional space, so his understanding of it was naturally almost zero. The location he had determined was, of course, the aura of the bandit that had fallen from the higher dimensional space that he had obtained from a certain restricted area. Hence, at this moment, when he pushed open the dimensional gate, he naturally chose to place it at the place where the bandit aura was the strongest. The moment he pushed open the gate, countless rays of light circulated, and the power of countless space-time dimensions surged wildly. Faintly, an unknown number of terrifying sounds were transmitted from the gate into the ears of everyone present. Just these sounds alone already contained some kind of indescribable, terrifying power of the space-time dimension. At this moment, even Luo Fan had an inexplicable expectation towards the space-time dimension. The door finally opened completely, and an incomparably mysterious mountain appeared behind the dimensional door. At first glance, this mountain peak seemed to be no different from ordinary low-dimensional mountain peaks, but upon closer inspection, one would be able to tell that it was different. This mountain was worlds apart from everything else in the lower space-time dimensions. It looked like an ordinary mountain, but it was actually constructed from countless space-time dimensions. Moreover, these space-time dimensions were not the kind that were perfect and could give birth to countless living beings and substances. Instead, they were extremely pure and tiny space-time dimensions. These tiny little things, the pure space-time dimensions, were arranged in a way similar to atoms. Finally, the endless space-time dimensions condensed into a stone or a bit of soil. In the end, there were countless stones and soil. That was why they had piled up into the mountain behind the dimensional gate. On the mountain peak there were countless plants and even animals running around. All of these had similar structures and were also formed from the condensation of countless space-time dimensions. At this moment, Wen Miao's face revealed an incomparably joyful expression. Without waiting for Luo Fan, she stepped into the dimensional gate first. After passing through the gate, she directly set foot on the mountain peak. The moment she set foot on the mountain peak, her body suddenly trembled. It was as if some indescribable law had descended from the sky and directly landed on her body. It violently poured into her and began to frantically destroy her body. At the same time, it rapidly reshaped her body, causing her body to rapidly change shape. In a short while, her body had already been completely transformed into another form. The other form was similar to that of the mountain peak and the living being on it. Countless tiny space-time dimensions piled up and condensed together to form cells. They formed cells, and from the countless cells, they condensed into her body, causing her body to gradually change. This is a law body refinement. When Luo Fan saw this scene, he faintly understood in his heart. At the same time, he was also shocked by the strength of the laws in this higher space-time dimension. Although Wen Miao's current level was still much lower than his, she was at least close to the level of the Supreme Emperor. With such strength, it was absolutely a fool's dream to think that ordinary laws could shake her body. Even him, if he wanted to use laws to hurt her, he would at least need to make countless deductions. He could only achieve this by using the method of moving 1,000 kilograms with little effort. Under such circumstances, the higher space-time dimension in front of him had so easily landed a wisp of laws on her body and completely changed her body. The terror of the laws in this higher space-time dimension was self-evident. However, since he was already here, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't hesitate. He just sighed and took a step forward, directly stepping into the dimensional gate and entering the higher space-time dimension. Right at this moment, he suddenly felt a boundless, terrifying power crushing down on him from all directions. It wanted to completely crush his body, his soul, his life essence, and everything about him. He knew that after this crushing, he would be reconstructed into a body structure that could adapt to the current space-time dimension in front of him. However, Luo Fan still wasn't willing to wait just like that. With just a thought, the unique space-time dimension that completely belonged to him naturally appeared outside his body. If this space-time dimension was in a normal lower space-time dimension, it would just be an invisible and intangible change related to time and space. However, here, in this higher space-time dimension, this originally invisible and intangible space-time dimension naturally evolved into a tangible form, forming a kind of gray light that wrapped around his body like smoke. With the emergence of this space-time dimension, at this moment, the terrifying power that was attacking his body from all directions and wanted to completely crush his body was directly received by the space-time dimension. This terrifying power caused the gray smoke-like space-time dimension to continuously distort and change, producing a faint creaking sound, as if it would completely collapse and be destroyed in the next moment. It really works. Luo Fan felt the power on his body disappear, and a faint smile appeared on his face. This was the meaning of the unique space-time dimension itself. Only by possessing a space-time dimension that completely belonged to oneself could one avoid the influence of other space-time dimensions. This was what Luo Fan had deduced from deducing the characteristics of a true saint, and it was a characteristic that a true saint needed to have. Therefore, it was obvious that this unique space-time dimension that completely belonged to him had to be able to resist the crushing power of the laws in this higher space-time dimension in order to be considered a successful independent space-time dimension. Otherwise, this space-time dimension would be a failure and should be abandoned. As for why he wanted to prevent this space-time dimension from transforming his body, it was even simpler. Becoming a true saint was a process of transcendence. It was a pursuit that allowed anything, any power, and any power. No terror could affect this process. Under such circumstances, if he entered a different world, he would have to transform his body and mind. Every time he entered a powerful world, he would have to assimilate with that world. Then, how could he pursue becoming a true saint? It would be better to directly choose a powerful world and enter it to enjoy a luxurious life. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was able to forcibly resist the transformation of the laws in this higher space-time dimension. No matter how difficult it was, no matter how hard it was, he had to maintain his purity. At this moment, Wu Miao looked at Luo Fan with incomparable shock. Why do you want to stop it? If that's the case, your body can be strengthened at least 10 times, and from now on, it will be 100 times easier for you to use the power of the space-time dimension. Isn't this a great benefit to the improvement of your strength? Why aren't you willing? She asked with incomparable curiosity. Because what I want is to become a true saint, not the supreme of this space-time dimension. Luo Fan smiled faintly. At this moment, the crushing power still existed and was still attacking the unique space-time dimension that had already materialized into a misty gray substance. However, a balance had been formed between the two. Although the pressure was still there, it had already been dispersed by the changes in the unique space-time dimension. Finally, this unique space-time dimension could no longer be destroyed, let alone hurt Luo Fan. And the changes brought about by this. It was just that there was a kind of misty gray substance constantly surging around Luo Fan's body. If it was regarded as a kind of cultivation phenomenon, it was considered nothing. What does this have to do with being unwilling to be transformed? Wu Miao still did not understand. A true saint must be able to step into the state of chaos and not be affected by anything. If one can't even resist the rules of this high space-time dimension, then what's the point of coming into contact with the state of chaos? Luo Fan said faintly. These words did not go into too much detail about the difference between becoming a true saint and becoming a supreme of this space-time dimension. It was just another way of explaining the reason for his actions. After all, to explain clearly, there were too many things that needed to be involved and too much effort needed to be expended. However, Luo Fan did not have the leisure to explain. However, even if this was the case, Just this explanation alone was enough to make Miao feel a grand and firm will rushing towards him. He faintly felt that the Luo fan in front of him had become unprecedentedly great. This the mentality of someone who is wholeheartedly focused on becoming a true saint. As expected, I'm still too far away. This thought flashed through Miao's mind. At this moment, Qing Longzi and the others also stepped through the dimensional gate and appeared in this high spacetime dimension. They did not have such a firm will like Luo Fan. They also did not have such a powerful method. As soon as they stepped into the higher spacetime dimension, they were instantly enveloped by the rules, which completely crushed their bodies. Through the modification of the rules, their bodies were rapidly transformed into a mysterious structure similar to Miao's body, which used the spacetime dimension as the basic unit of units. However, compared to Miao, their transformation speed was many times slower. From the moment Miao stepped into this place until her body was completely transformed, it only took a few breaths. However, even the fastest of them took more than a month before their entire body was transformed, completely transforming the structure of their bodies into a structure similar to Miao's. With regards to this, Luo Fan was a little surprised at first, but very quickly, he came to a sudden realization. The fundamental reason why Miao's transformation was so fast was very simple. It was because she was originally a living creature of the high spacetime dimension. In other words, the structure in front of him was the true structure of her body. The structure from before was just a mutation caused by her falling into a low spacetime dimension and suffering from the damage caused by the falling spacetime dimension. In other words, her transformation just now was equivalent to treating a minor illness like a cold or a fever. Of course, it was cured very quickly. In comparison to Qing Longzi and the rest, the body form from before was their true form. The form that they were going to transform into now was a brand new form that they had never seen before. This transformation was equivalent to cloning a living creature from a cell. It went without saying how many times more difficult it was than treating a cold or a fever. In this way, it was only natural that Miao's transformation speed was so much faster. Fortunately, these people who were being transformed were all people with extremely strong willpower. The physical and mental pain was not enough to make them cry out in pain. Otherwise, this mountain would have been shrouded in incomparably mournful howls over the past month. After more than a month, the approaching rules completely disappeared. When the body transformation power completely disappeared, Qing Longzi and the rest felt as if they had come to heaven from hell. Every single one of their faces was filled with shock and joy. The aura around them was many times stronger than before, so powerful. All of them were carefully inspecting their own bodies. Occasionally they would spit out these two words. Their expressions of joy made it impossible to tell that they were extremely powerful cultivators. Instead, they seemed like idiots,